Have you ever wondered why some lights are never meant to be turned off, even when no one seems to need them? Out on the edge of a quiet orchard, there's a single lantern that has glowed at the same time every night for decades. It doesn't mark a path to a busy road, and it doesn't warn ships away from a rocky shore. Yet still, without fail, it's lit, as though it's keeping a silent promise to someone who may never return. On certain evenings when the air is cool and the apples are heavy on the branches, the light looks softer, almost like it's breathing. From far away, it could be mistaken for a star caught between the leaves, but up close it carries the warmth of a memory that refuses to fade, the kind of memory that makes you slow down, just to feel it linger a little longer. Tonight, I'll take you there. We'll walk along the narrow path between the trees, hear the grass whisper beneath our steps, and watch the lantern's glow grow brighter as we draw near. And maybe, as the night folds itself gently around us, you'll discover why its light has never gone out. Now, let's begin. The day had been a quiet one, the sort of day when the hours seem to rest rather than pass. The sun, low and mellow in the late summer sky, had drawn a soft amber curtain over the orchard. Each apple tree stood in its place, as it had for years, with branches bending under the weight of ripening fruit. The grass beneath them was longer than it used to be in Henry's younger days, but it swayed in the same patient rhythm with every breath of wind. Henry closed the back door of the farmhouse slowly, as though there were no reason to hurry. And indeed, there wasn't. The air outside was warm, but touched with the faintest coolness, a reminder that autumn was only a few steps away. In his right hand he carried the old tin of matches, in his left, the lantern with its glass sides clouded from age and use. It had been years since anyone asked him why he lit it each evening, and he was glad for the silence around the question. Some things, he thought, should be left alone, so they can keep on being what they are. The porch steps creaked under his weight, the same creak on the same step that had been there for decades. Beyond the steps, a narrow path led into the orchard. It was a path worn smooth by time and footsteps, his own, his wife's, and the countless small wanderings of the years they'd lived together here. As he began walking, the grass whispered softly against his boots. Somewhere nearby, a robin gave a short, questioning note, then fell silent again. Henry paused beside the first tree, a sturdy old apple planted by his father the year he was born. The bark was thick and furrowed now, gray in places, and on one side a patch of moss caught the golden light. He ran his hand over the trunk, the way a man might greet an old friend. No words, just touch. From here, he could see the far end of the orchard where the bench sat under the great apple tree, and just above it, the branch where the lantern belonged. The bench was weathered, the wood silvered by seasons of sun and rain. It sagged slightly in the middle, but it was sound enough for sitting, and the seat held the faint scent of the cedar oil he used to rub into it every spring. The lantern's hook was still firm in the branch, as if the tree had grown itself around the duty of holding it. When Henry reached the bench, he set the lantern down carefully on the worn seat and stood for a moment, looking out across the orchard. The evening light was turning everything softer. The reds of the apples, the greens of the leaves, even the shadows between the rows. It was the hour when the world seemed to sigh, when the work of the day was done, and all that remained was to notice what had been given. Henry lifted the match tin and shook it gently. The sound was small but comforting, like the faint rattle of seeds in a pod. He struck a match, shielding the tiny flame with his hand against the mild breeze. The wick caught with a quiet, eager glow, and in another moment, the lantern was lit, sending a warm amber light spilling onto the bench, the grass, and the lower branches of the tree. He sat down beside it, resting the match tin on his knee, and let his gaze wander. From here, the orchard seemed endless, though he knew exactly where it ended. At the fence line near the brook, beyond which the neighbor's pasture began. In the hush, he could hear the slow trickle of water over stones, a sound as familiar to him as his own breathing. Lighting the lantern had never been about seeing in the dark. It was about keeping a promise, though to whom and for what only Henry knew, and he carried that knowledge quietly, like a letter folded deep in his coat pocket. Sometimes he wondered if the lantern's light reached anyone at all, or if it was only for him, but when the thought came, it was always chased away by the memory of his wife, standing at the kitchen window years ago, smiling faintly as she saw it glowing at the far edge of the orchard. He leaned back against the bench, feeling the wood's gentle give beneath his shoulders. The light from the lantern reached his hands, painting them gold. He watched as a moth, pale and fragile, drifted toward the glass, circled once, and then moved on, seeking another brightness somewhere in the gathering dusk. The air smelled of apples, earth, and the faint resin of the cedar bench. Each breath he took felt steady, unhurried, as though the orchard itself had slowed his heart to match its pace. Somewhere above, the first stars were beginning to appear, though their light was shy and almost lost in the fading glow of the sun. In the distance, a dog barked once, a friendly, half-hearted bark that belonged to a farm settling down for the night. The sound made Henry smile. He thought of all the evenings like this one, the ones past and the ones still to come, and felt the quiet reassurance that they would go on as long as the lantern was lit and the orchard kept watch. For now, he would sit a while longer, letting the light rest beside him until the night fully gathered itself around the trees. There was no rush, there never was, out here. The next evening came much the same way as the one before, without any hurry, without the weight of urgent business. The sun slid down toward the horizon in its own untroubled fashion, and the shadows of the trees stretched themselves across the orchard grass, as though they too were ready for rest. Henry moved through the familiar rooms of the farmhouse with the quiet steps of a man who had lived there long enough to know exactly where the floorboards would creak. On the kitchen table sat the tin of matches, waiting for him the way a faithful dog might wait by the door. He picked it up along with the lantern and stepped out into the evening air. The sky was a pale wash of color, not yet the deep blues of night, but no longer the gold of day either. That in-between light always felt tender to Henry, as though the world were pausing to take a breath before moving on. He followed the narrow path into the orchard, his boots pressing the grass flat in slow, steady steps. Somewhere high in the branches, a dove was cooing, low and rhythmic, the sound weaving itself into the air like a lullaby. Henry glanced at the apples above him, some of them heavy enough to bow their branches toward the earth. He made a mental note to gather a few for the kitchen in the morning, though he knew he would likely take his time about it, picking one tree a day until the baskets were full. When he reached the bench beneath the old apple tree, he set the lantern down as he always did, but before striking the match, he let his gaze drift past the rows of trees toward the low fence at the orchard's edge. That was when he noticed the movement, a small figure just beyond the fence line. hesitating like someone unsure whether they were welcome. Henry stayed seated, the lantern resting cold beside him. The figure resolved itself into a young woman, or perhaps a girl on the cusp of womanhood, with hair the color of early autumn chestnuts and a book clutched close to her side. She moved slowly, as though each step was a question, and when she reached the open gate, she paused again. "Evening," Henry called softly, not wanting to startle her. The girl looked up, and for a moment her expression was guarded, the way strangers look at one another before deciding whether to speak. Then she gave a small nod. "Evening," she replied, her voice carrying a quiet shyness. She stepped into the orchard, and Henry could see now that she was no more than 17 or 18. Her coat was worn at the cuffs, and the soles of her shoes carried a dusting of the road. In her hands she held out the book, a slim volume with a faded green cover. "I think this belongs to you," she said, offering it. Henry recognized it at once, a collection of old farm poems he had lent to his neighbor's granddaughter the month before. "You're Lucy, then," he said, taking the book gently. She nodded again, and for a moment neither of them spoke. Henry gestured to the bench. "You're welcome to sit a spell if you'd like." Lucy hesitated, then lowered herself onto the far end of the bench, her hands folded neatly in her lap. The space between them held the soft hum of the evening, crickets beginning their song, the faint rustle of a breeze in the leaves overhead. "Your orchard looks different in the evening," Lucy said after a while, her eyes following the rows of trees disappearing into the dimming light. Henry smiled faintly. "It's quieter," he said. "The trees settle down, same as folks do." He struck a match then, the small flame bright against the growing dusk, and lit the lantern. The glow spread slowly, touching the bench, the grass at their feet, the folds of Lucy's coat. She watched it closely, as though there were something more to the act than just lighting a lamp. "My grandmother used to say," Lucy began, "that a light in the distance can make you feel less alone, even if you never go to it." Henry let the words rest between them for a moment before answering. "She was right," he said quietly. "Sometimes the knowing is enough, knowing it's there." They sat together in the growing night, speaking little. Henry found that Lucy's presence didn't disturb the orchard's peace. If anything, it seemed to fold her into its stillness. When she finally stood to leave, he walked her to the gate. She paused there, glancing back at the lantern, and gave a small smile before stepping onto the lane that led toward her home. Henry watched until her figure was swallowed by the dim light, then turned back toward the bench. The lantern glowed steadily, as though it had been part of their meeting all along, a quiet witness to the unplanned exchange. He sat for a while longer, letting the night deepen, the cricket's song weaving through the branches. Somewhere, far off, a whip-poor-will called into the darkness. Henry listened, thinking that perhaps the orchard had gained something new tonight. Not a change exactly, but an addition, like a single thread worked into a pattern that had been the same for years. When at last he rose to go inside, the lantern still burned behind him, its light falling on the bench where two people had sat, and on the grass where their words had quietly settled. Morning came gently, as if the fields themselves had decided to lift their eyelids and look around. The first light was pale, a thin ribbon along the horizon, and then it widened until the orchard revealed itself, each branch and leaf showing its shape the way a sleeper slowly remembers where they are. Henry stood at the kitchen sink, his hands wrapped around a mug that had a tiny chip on the rim. Steam rose and disappeared into the cool air. The house was quiet enough to hear the clock, and when the wind shifted, the faint murmur of the brook at the back of the property. He didn't rush. There was no hour demanding he keep to it, no bell to answer, only the small, sturdy duties that knit a life together. When he stepped outside, the yard offered him the scent of damp soil. Dew had settled during the night, glassing each blade of grass, each fallen leaf. The path into the orchard looked familiar and new at once, scratched at the edges by the rabbits that came in the dark, pocked by the light tracks of a raccoon near the compost pile. Henry noted it all the way a farmer does, not aggressively, not possessively, only as a way of saying to himself, "This is what the night has brought, and this is what the day will meet." He carried a small basket and a short-handled pruning knife, the one with the worn hickory grip that fit his palm like an old handshake. He also brought a length of twine. The twine wasn't for anything in particular. It had simply found its way into his pocket because it always had. He had tied vines to stakes with it, bundled last year's lavender, fixed a loose gate latch more times than he could count. In a place like this, a length of twine seldom went unused for long. The orchard held a hush peculiar to early autumn, a quiet that isn't empty but full of the steady processes of ripeness and retreat. Leaves were green still, but they carried a shadowed tone now, the hint of gold waiting in their veins. Some apples had already dropped and lay in the grass with soft bruises, sweetening the air in a way that made Henry think of kitchens and wood stoves and hands dusted with flour. He crouched beside one tree and lifted a fallen fruit to his nose before setting it aside for the deer that liked to visit the eastern fence at dusk. He inspected each tree with a patience that had long ago stopped being a decision. He checked for the lacing of caterpillars, the dark scab that sometimes formed near a stem, the way a branch joined its trunk enough to carry another season. At one tree, he found a limb bowed lower than it should be, heavy with clustered fruit. He braced a shoulder beneath it, relieved the weight, and tied a supporting length of twine from the branch to a higher crook. When he stepped back, the limb settled with a grateful shiver, as if the tree could exhale. The sun climbed slowly, and with it came the small brightnesses of the day. A pair of chickadees arguing amiably over a twig, a reluctant breeze rustling the tallest leaves, a lone cloud trailing a thin shadow that cooled his neck for the length of 2 breaths. Henry wasn't thinking of much. That was the day's gift. Thoughts came like birds alighting and flew off just as easily. He let them go. When he reached the bench beneath the old apple, the tree with bark like a quilt of gray and brown, he set his basket down and sat a while. The bench, shaped to him by years, received his weight without complaint. The lantern hook above glinted briefly. He ran a thumb along the lantern's metal frame, the way one might touch a family heirloom without needing to explain why. The glass still bore the faint smoke of last night's flame. A moth's dust traced a ghostly arc in one pane, as if even dreams had wanted to look more closely. He remembered Lucy then, not urgently, not with any ache, only as he might remember the sound of rain on a tin roof or the smell of pine in December. Her visit had slid into the orchard story with such lightness that it only deepened the quiet rather than broke it. He considered the book she'd returned, lying now on the kitchen table at home. He could see the dog-eared pages his wife had left years ago, the penciled check marks in the margins, small approvals from another season of life. He felt, not for the first time, that the life he had lived with her was still here, still present, like water moving beneath ice, slowed, refracted, but not gone. He rose to walk the farther rows, where the ground sloped toward the brook. There the air was cooler, the grass held a deeper green, and the sound of water gave the trees a kind of companionable privacy, as though they conversed in undertones. The brook, narrowed by a dry summer, stuttered over stones with the voice that had known him since he was a boy, fishing with string and a bent pin. He stopped and listened. You could learn a lot, he'd found, by listening to a thing that had no intention of being heard. He gathered a few apples into his basket, not the brightest, not the biggest, but the ones whose stems turned easily to his hand, surrendering without protest. Each drop into the basket made a soft thump, a domestic sound, reassuring as the swing of a porch door, as the creak of a well-used stair. He paused to wipe one on his sleeve and took a slow bite. It broke with a tender snap. Juice lifted the taste of sun and rain in patient days. He ate standing among the trees and felt for a small moment as steady and rooted as they were. By late morning, the light had cleared into a finer blue. A hawk wrote its name against the sky with the black punctuation of wings. Henry finished by the fence at the far edge of the orchard, where wild asters made pale stars at his boots. He couldn't help noticing the gate, how the latch had loosened since June. With a few twists of twine, he gave it a temporary rightness. He would bring the proper tool in the afternoon, he told himself, though he wouldn't mind if the work waited another day. The orchard did not demand perfection, it only asked for attention. He took the long way back to the house, past the little patch of herbs that had outlived the summer, thyme clinging wisely to its scent, sage silvering into its best season. He cut a sprig and held it to his nose and thought how often simple things insisted on being adequate to the heart. Inside, the kitchen accepted him the way a pond accepts a stone, without judgment, with a soft reshaping. He set the basket on the table, rinsed his hands in cool water, and let the day idle for a while. On the windowsill sat the book of poems Lucy had returned. He opened it not to read but to look at the handwriting in the front, his wife's name in a careful script, and beneath it a single line copied from one of the poems. Keep a small light where the heart returns. He smiled, not because it was clever, but because it was true. The afternoon unrolled itself with the calm of a well-worn road. Henry napped in a chair by the door, 20 minutes that felt like a blessing. When he woke, the sun had moved to the western side of the house, and the orchard had shifted into its late-day voice. Fewer birds, more cricket. He sharpened the pruning knife with slow strokes, a patient scrape against the stone, then set it aside. The trees could wait. He warmed a kettle, cut a slice of bread, and spread it with apple butter from last year's jars. The first taste held September in it, the hum of bees, the wooden spoon scraping a pot, the clean snap of a jar lid sealing shut on the counter. Toward evening, he took his seat on the back steps and watched light gather itself under the trees. It came there in layers, gold, then rose, then the quiet gray that means the lantern hour has arrived. He gathered the lantern, the match tint, and out of habit slipped the twine back into his pocket. The path accepted him again, and the orchard seemed to lean in, as if to hear a story told not in words but in footsteps. At the bench, he set the lantern down and waited a long minute without lighting it. Waiting was part of the ritual. It acknowledged that light was not his to command, but his to tend. When the first star pierced the sky above the woodlot, he struck a match. The flame lifted like a small decision courageously kept. It touched the wick, caught and steadied. The lantern's glow spread, modest at first, then sure, making a soft aureole around the bench and along the grass where moths would soon scribble their white cursive. He thought for a time of nothing more than the way the light held, but thoughts returned as they do, slowly, kindly, and one of them was Lucy. He wondered whether she was reading this evening, whether the road dust had shaken from her shoes, whether the quiet of her house had a window that faced this way. He didn't need to know. It was enough to sit with the knowing that people sometimes find what they need by seeing a light that isn't theirs, a light that asks nothing in return. The night settled further. Crickets stitched a fine seam through the field, and a breeze moved softly in the uppermost leaves, like someone turning a page without meaning to wake a sleeping child. Henry rested his hands on his knees and let the thought come to him that days like this are what most of life consists of. Not milestones, not announcements, but the faithful sequence of small attendings. A gate latch mended, a limb relieved, a bench that remembers your shape. When at last he stood to go, he looked once more up through the branches. The sky had opened to its deeper blues, and the lantern glowed in answer, a warm reply to an old question. He left it there, as he always did, a quiet promise shining at the edge of things. On his way back along the path, the grass brushed his boots with the gentleness of a welcome and a farewell. At the kitchen door, he paused, listening to the orchard, the way he might listen at the bedside of a loved one sleeping. Everything was breathing, everything was at rest. He stepped inside, set the empty basket on a chair, and turned the key with a soft click that felt like gratitude. Tomorrow he would fetch the tool for the gate, or he wouldn't. He would prune a limb, or he would let the tree have its way. He would see what the morning asked, and in the orchard the lantern kept its patient vigil, sending out its small, unwavering circle, far enough to be seen, close enough to be human. It held the night without conquering it, as a good memory holds sadness without erasing it, and makes the heart brave enough to rest. The morning after had come and gone without hurry. Henry's hours moved in their usual unforced way. Coffee, the slow inspection of the orchard, a few small repairs to the shed roof where the shingles had begun to curl. The day was mild enough that he kept the windows open in the kitchen, letting the wind wander in with the scent of leaves beginning to turn. There was no sign, no plan that anything different might happen before the evening came again. But as the afternoon light began to soften, taking on that slant which seems to lift the edges of shadows and turn them into something gentle, Henry caught sight of movement at the far end of the lane. It was a figure he recognized even from that distance, though they had met only once. Lucy, in her worn coat, carrying something small in her hands. She was walking at the kind of pace that belongs to people who have decided there is no need to rush, yet have something in mind they wish to reach. Henry stayed on the porch until she came near enough to see his smile. She lifted one hand in greeting, then stepped up to the porch, holding out a paper-wrapped bundle. "I baked these this morning," she said, her voice shy but steady. "They're apple turnovers. My grandmother said you might like some." He took the bundle with both hands as if it were a gift more delicate than it appeared. The paper was still faintly warm, and the smell of cinnamon rose between them. "Well now," Henry said, "you're starting to make me think I'll need to earn this somehow." Lucy only smiled, brushing a loose strand of hair behind her ear. "I just thought you might want something sweet to go with the evening," she said. He invited her in, but she shook her head. "If you don't mind, I'd rather sit out in the orchard," she said. "It's quieter there." Henry nodded, understanding. Some conversations, or silences, simply belonged among the trees. They walked together along the path, the grass brushing at their ankles. The sun was just low enough to make the apples glow in their skins, a soft red deepened by the slanting light. Somewhere in the distance, a tractor muttered over a neighbor's field, but the sound was far off, softened by rows of trees in the open sky. At the bench beneath the old apple tree, Henry set the turnovers beside the lantern, which waited unlit for its hour. They sat without speaking for a time, the orchard holding its familiar hush. Lucy's eyes moved from tree to tree as though she were counting them, or perhaps remembering their positions for another day. "My grandmother used to bring me here when I was little," she said finally. "We'd walk past your fence and she'd tell me stories about the orchard, about how your wife used to hang laundry between the rows in summer. I don't think I ever really believed her until I saw it for myself last week." Henry smiled softly at the memory, the picture of white sheets moving in the orchard. Breeze. She liked the smell of sun on clean cloth, he said it was better than anything a store could sell in a bottle. I suppose she was right. Lucy nodded, and for a while they both watched a pair of leaves spiraling down from a high branch, turning over and over until they settled on the grass. It was a small, unremarkable thing, yet it seemed to fill the moment completely. Henry unwrapped the turnovers and offered one to Lucy. The pastry was flaky under their fingers, and the filling let go its warmth in a slow drift of steam. They ate without hurry, the light deepening around them. Each bite tasted of the orchard itself, apple, spice, and the patient work of seasons. When they had finished, Henry brushed the crumbs from his lap and reached for the match tin. The sound of the matches rattling inside was as familiar as a clock chime in an old house. He struck one and brought it to the lantern's wick. The flame caught, then steadied, and the light spread out across the bench, across their hands, along the rough bark of the tree. Lucy leaned back slightly, her eyes on the glow. "It's strange," she said quietly. "You'd think it would make the orchard feel smaller, but somehow it makes it feel larger. Like the light keeps going, even past where you can see it." Henry looked at her, recognizing in her words the same truth his wife had once voiced. "It does?" he agreed. "Not in the way a street lamp does, though. It's a different kind of seeing." They sat like that for a long while, speaking only when a thought rose naturally. Mostly, they let the evening fill itself in, the rustle of a bird settling in for the night, the faint creak of the bench under their shifting weight, the steady glow of the lantern. Eventually, Lucy stood, brushing a wrinkle from her coat. "I should get back before it's too dark," she said. Henry walked her to the gate, the lantern's light following them in a loose halo until the path curved. At the gate, Lucy paused. "I think I understand why you light it now," she said. "It's not just for you." Henry met her gaze, a smile in his eyes. "No," he said softly. "It never was." She left then, her figure becoming a part of the dimming lane until it was gone. Henry stood for a moment longer, listening to the way the orchard breathed in the cool air, then returned to the bench. The lantern burned on, patient and unwavering. Above it, the branches shifted gently, their leaves catching the light before letting it go again. And for the rest of the evening, Henry stayed there. letting the night gather around him like an old familiar quilt, warm in its weight, steady in its keeping. Rain arrived without announcement, the way a guest might appear at a back door already half ashamed to have come. It began as a thin hush over the fields, a traveling softness you could hear before you felt it. Henry, standing at the kitchen window, watched the far pasture blur, first the fence posts, then the hedgerow, until the world settled into a single gentle color. The roof took up the sound as if it had been practicing for it all summer. The tin found its steady rhythm, and the house grew smaller in the best way, like a hand cupped around a candle. He put water on to boil and laid out the familiar things: 2 thick mugs, a tin of tea leaves, the small jar of honey that tasted faintly of clover. The table under the window carried the book Lucy had returned, and beside it a folded dish towel he didn't remember folding, only finding folded, as if the house itself preferred to keep order when his attention wandered elsewhere. He listened to the kettle rise toward its voice and thought how many rainy afternoons had gathered here and left, each one laying down the same quiet on the floorboards. Outside, the orchard softened around the edges, drops stitched silver lines from leaf to leaf and pooled along the curve of apples not yet picked. From this distance he could make out the lantern hook, empty for now, a small comma waiting at the end of a sentence that evening would finish. He loved the orchard most on days like this, when everything agreed to speak in undertones. He poured the water, watched the tea bloom, and cupped the mug in both hands. A little warmth moved up his wrists, enough to remind him that comfort could be a small thing faithfully offered. He carried the mug to the back steps and sat where the roofline kept him mostly dry, knees almost touching the rain. Beyond the steps, the path to the orchard held shallow mirrors of sky. He thought about lighting the lantern early, but then decided against it. There was a rightness to holding some habits in their appointed hour. Lucy came in the middle of the afternoon, under a brown umbrella that had lost 2 ribs to some other wind. He saw her first as a shape in the wet, then as the bright, particular person she was. Hair darkened by the rain, cheeks lifted with a kind of shy delight at having braved the weather for no grand reason. She paused at the gate and shook the umbrella gently, more to be polite to the grass than to dry the cloth. "Evening comes sooner today," she said, smiling, as she stepped onto the porch. "It does," Henry answered. "Come in and warm up. I've just made tea." Inside, the house welcomed her, the way a shawl welcomes shoulders. She set the umbrella in the sink, and Henry handed her the second mug he had poured, without knowing he would need it. They stood a moment by the window, mugs steaming, watching the orchard soften and sharpen as the rain thickened and thinned. "My grandmother used to say the rain is when the world remembers to be kind to itself," Lucy said. Henry nodded. A good day to learn by watching then. They took their tea to the small table. The book of poems lay between them, its green cover dulled by use. Lucy touched the corner with one finger, as if asking permission, then opened to a page where the margin held a light pencil line, thin as a thread. She glanced at Henry, and he nodded for her to read. Her voice, untrained but steady, found the rhythm of the old words. The poem spoke of harvests measured not only by full baskets, but by the patient hands that had lifted them, of time as a companion who walked without comment beside the plow. It talked about rain as more than weather, as a slowing down, a way of letting the ground remember what it needed to hold. When she finished, she kept her finger in the page and rested her other hand around the mug. palms absorbing warmth as if saving it for later. "My wife liked that one," Henry said. "She used to say it forgave us when we didn't get everything done." Lucy smiled faintly. "I like that a poem can do that." For a while, they listened to the roof carry the rain's small footfalls. The house had its familiar noises, the kettle settling back into silence, the clock agreeing with itself once every second, the deep beam above the stove answering the weather with a long, comfortable creak. Henry rose and cut 2 slices of the bread he'd baked last week, set them on a plate with a small dish of honey. They ate without hurry, the sweet pulling the edge off the gray of the afternoon. After a time, Lucy stood and moved to the window again. "I think the orchard looks larger in the rain," she said, "as if each tree is listening to something just out of our hearing." "It is," Henry answered. "The ground mostly. The roots talk when we're quiet." They put on their coats and stepped into the soft weather, taking the umbrella more as a tradition than a necessity. The air met them kindly, the rain fell fine as breath. They walked a short way to the orchard, keeping to the firm edges of the path where puddles held the day in small bright ovals. Among the trees, everything had been rearranged into gentleness. Leaves collected droplets along their ribs, each drop a clear bead that trembled and did not fall. Apples wore the rain like a polish, their skins deepened to the colors of evening. A thrush, not minding the wet, moved low, stitching the grass with quick steps. They stood beneath the old apple tree that kept the bench in its shade. The bench was damp but not soaked. Henry spread the folded dish towel along the seat, and they sat with the easy caution of people who intend to stay a while. Rain threaded itself along the lantern's glass, leaving narrow paths as if to chart the places a flame would later warm. Henry told a small story about the orchard in a year when the rain did not come like this, when the ground made a tight sound underfoot and the brook learned the language of stones. He told it simply, without drama, only to say that he remembered, and that remembering had taught him to be grateful for afternoons like this one. Lucy listened, hands folded, eyes steady. When he finished, she spoke about the market in town, how the woman at the flower stall tied bunches with raffia and a practiced tenderness, how she had slipped a stem of rosemary into Lucy's bag with no charge, because rosemary remembers. They sat in that exchange, one story offered, one story returned, the way you might pass a bowl of fruit back and forth until each person has taken the piece meant for them. After a while, the rain shifted to a lighter hand. Henry looked upward, tracking the thinning of drops through patches of leaf and sky. "It will be lantern time soon," he said, not to announce an action, but to note the hour's character. They rose and walked the nearer rows, not to inspect, but to greet. At a low branch heavy with fruit, Henry lifted a hand and relieved the weight of 2 apples into his palm. He gave one to Lucy. They did not eat them. Some gifts want a slower table, so they carried them as they walked, palms shaped around their roundness, the skins cool and promising. When they returned to the bench, the light had become the gray that invites a glow. Henry set the umbrella against the tree and took the match tin from his pocket. He shook it lightly. The sound answered the steady quiet like a small bell. He struck a match, and in the brief flare, Lucy's face appeared as if called forward out of the dim, a momentary portrait that looked older than its years and younger than its worries. The lantern took the flame and settled into itself. Its warm circle began near. then widened, its edge soft but sure along the grass. Rain made a thin silver veil around the light, catching and letting go, catching and letting go. The orchard seemed to lean toward it, not for illumination so much as companionship. Henry set the lit lantern back on its hook. They sat again, close enough to feel the light on their hands. Neither spoke for a long while, because nothing was missing from the quiet. At last Lucy said, "On nights like this, I think I could sleep in the open without fear." "You would be welcome," Henry said, "but I expect your grandmother would have a word about damp blankets." Lucy laughed softly, the sound of a brook deciding not to hurry. "I suppose she would." The rain eased by degrees until it was only a leftover shimmer in the air. The orchard lifted itself. Leaves shook lightly, the way shoulders adjust a garment. A rabbit emerged from under the low reach of a young tree, paused to tag the evening with its attention, and then went on. Henry told her then, not as a confession, only as news, about the line his wife had copied in the front of the poem book. "Keep a small light where the heart returns." He said it in the calm voice of someone passing a lantern to a person he trusts to carry it. Lucy listened and did not try to answer for a time. When she did, she only said, "I think I will remember that." And the way she said it made it sound already remembered. They let the dark come closer. From the pasture, the neighbors' cattle moved as one slow thought toward their shelter. Somewhere in the hedge, a sparrow made the last adjustment to its night place. The lantern's glow took on its night color, less bright and more present, like a hand resting on a table between friends. When it was time for Lucy to go, they didn't name it. She stood, and Henry stood, and they walked the short path to the gate. At the curve where the lantern's circle gave way to evening, she stopped and looked back through the light to the bench, to the tree, to the house that waited with its one kitchen window bright. "Good night," she said. "Good night," Henry answered. "Walk easy." He watched until the shape of her umbrella had been folded into the lane and the lane into the whiter gray. Then he returned to the bench and sat with the lantern long enough to feel that nothing important had been left undone. He thought of the gate latch he had meant to fix and decided it could learn patience from the night. When at last he rose to go in, he left the lantern burning as he always did. Its light lay on the grass in a simple geometry, as certain as the way a heart chooses its home. The orchard breathed around it, wet earth, leaf, a faint chord of apple and rain, and somewhere the brook rearranged the dark with its small silver grammar. Inside the house he set 2 apples on the table and put the kettle on once more. He washed the mugs and set them upside down on the towel, then turned one right way up again, because habit and hospitality often share a hand. Before he closed the door for the night, he looked once more toward the orchard. The lantern held the edge of things tenderly but firmly, not to keep the dark out, only to keep the place where someone might return clearly marked. Henry turned the key. In the quiet that followed, he could hear the rain gather itself for a final whisper along the eaves, and then let go. He sat in his chair by the door, not to think, but to be. The house, the orchard, the lantern, the slow, learned breath of a man at peace with the ordinary. These were the evening's whole company, and as the last light from the kitchen drifted into the yards and thinned among the trees, the lantern in the orchard kept its gentle hour, steady as a remembered promise, soft as sleep, finding the tired. The week that followed did not hurry itself. It spread out like a long sheet of linen laid across a sunny field. each day folding softly into the next without edge or seam. The orchard was in a mood of quiet patience. It was the kind of patience that doesn't ask for notice, but receives it from anyone willing to look closely. The slow turning of leaves toward the first hints of yellow, the almost inaudible stretch of apples ripening in their skins. Henry woke each morning to the same unassuming light in the kitchen, poured his coffee into the same heavy mug, and stepped to the back door as though greeting the day was a matter of keeping faith. From there, the orchard greeted him back in its own way, the air smelling faintly of sweetening fruit, the grass holding dew like a careful secret. He would stand for a few minutes, neither moving nor measuring time, until his breathing matched the easy rhythm outside. These were the days between busier moments, the kind that some might call uneventful, though Henry never did. There was the mending of a fence post the wind had loosened, a visit to the shed to sharpen the blade of his pruning saw, the gentle brushing away of leaves from the stone path where moss liked to gather in the shaded hours. Evening always came the same way, slipping into the corners first, then filling the space between branches until the lantern was needed. Lucy did not come every day, but neither was she far from Henry's thoughts. When she appeared on the lane, her step light but deliberate, he would meet her at the gate or halfway along the path. They rarely planned their talks. Sometimes she brought news of the town, small things like the price of eggs at the market or the return of a neighbor's son from his work in another county. Other times she brought nothing but herself, and they would walk among the trees in a shared quiet that was as full as any conversation. One afternoon, Lucy arrived carrying a small tin box. It was a sort of box that once might have held tea or hard candies. The paint faded to a soft green, the lid dented just enough to make opening it a patient act. She set it on the bench beside Henry and opened it to reveal a handful of old photographs. "These were in my grandmother's drawer," she said. "I thought you might like to see them." They leaned over the little collection together. Some of the photographs were in black and white, the edges scalloped, showing the orchard in earlier years, rows of trees younger and more upright, the grass kept close as a freshly combed head of hair. In one, Henry's wife stood in the middle of a row, a basket hooked over her arm, her other hand shading her eyes from the sun. Henry touched the corner of that picture gently. "She used to hum when she picked apples," he said, "a tune without words, but I'd know it anywhere." Lucy smiled. "My grandmother said she could hear it from the road sometimes." They spent the better part of an hour looking through the pictures, Henry telling a brief story here and there. A year of heavy frost that had threatened the blossoms, a summer so dry the brook nearly forgot its way, the time a stray calf had wandered in and tasted the lower branches before being led back home. The photographs made the orchard's years visible in a way that even Henry's memory couldn't quite do on its own. As the light began to slope toward evening, Lucy placed the photographs back in their tin, and Henry set the tin carefully on the bench between them. Neither of them spoke for a while. The orchard's sounds took over, the hum of insects in the tall grass, the faint shifting of a branch in the breeze, the brook whispering its steady, unhurried language. When it was time, Henry reached for the match tin. The small rattle inside felt as familiar in his hand as the worn grip of a tool well used. He lit the lantern, and its glow reached across the bench, brushing Lucy's hands in the green tin box. For a moment, the light seemed to hold all the photographs inside it, as if it, too, were remembering. Lucy stood after a while, brushing her palms lightly against her skirt. "I should take these back to my grandmother," she said, nodding toward the tin. Henry rose and handed it to her with both hands. "Tell her thank you," he said, "for letting the orchard see itself again." She smiled and started down the path, the lantern's glow following her until the trees took her into the evening. Henry remained by the bench, listening to the air cool and the day fold itself neatly away. The lantern kept its steady circle of light, a quiet keeper of the space between what had been and what was still to come. When he finally made his way back to the house, Henry paused at the porch to look once more toward the orchard. The light there seemed even softer from a distance, as if it had joined the company of the stars beginning to appear overhead. He thought about how the orchard had been lit in one way or another for so many years, by sunlight, by moonlight, by the lantern's flame, and how each light in its own time had been enough. Inside, he set his mug in the sink, rinsed it, and left it upside down on the towel. The house was still, holding the rain's absence and the day's presence in equal measure. When he turned out the kitchen light, the last thing he saw through the window was the lantern's glow resting in the orchard, like a small promise kept. The first light of morning came softly through the kitchen window, spilling a pale gold across the worn boards of the floor. Henry stood at the counter, tying the last knot in the string around a small basket handle. It was the sort of knot he had tied thousands of times, firm enough to last the day, loose enough to be undone without trouble. Outside, the air was still cool from the night, and a low mist clung to the ground as if reluctant to leave. The orchard was waiting. He poured himself a cup of coffee, the steam rising steady, and sat for a moment at the table. There was no hurry. The apples would be there whether he stepped into the rows now or an hour from now. Still, the first picking of the season held a quiet pull on him, the way the first frost or the first bird call of spring does. It marked a turning, subtle but certain. By the time he stepped out onto the porch, the mist was lifting and the grass shimmered with dew. He could see the orchard clearly now, rows upon rows, the trees full and heavy, their branches dipping toward the earth. Somewhere toward the middle, a bird was singing a short, repeated note, as if calling for company. Lucy arrived not long after, her coat unbuttoned and her hair gathered loosely at the nape of her neck. She carried 2 baskets, one hooked over each arm. "I thought we might fill more than one today," she said, her voice touched with the brightness of early morning. Henry smiled and took one of the baskets from her. "Ambitious," he said, "but the trees will be glad for the help." They walked the path into the orchard, their boots leaving narrow impressions in the damp grass. The air held that unmistakable scent of ripe apples, a mingling of sweetness and earth, touched by the faint sharpness of fallen fruit beginning to soften in the grass. It was a scent Henry had known his whole life, and it settled over him now like an old trusted coat. They began at the first row, standing on opposite sides of a tree whose branches spread wide, each one adorned with fruit that caught the light like small suns. Henry reached for an apple just above his head, giving it a slight twist until it released into his hand. He examined it for a moment before placing it gently in the basket at his feet. Lucy mirrored his movements on the other side, her fingers careful, as if each apple held something more than its weight. For a while, the only sounds were the soft thud of fruit settling into the baskets and the occasional rustle of leaves as a branch was brushed aside. A bee wandered near, circled one of the apples in Lucy's hand, and moved on without argument. The sun was climbing, filtering through the leaves in shifting patches, dappling their faces in the ground beneath them. Henry paused to watch Lucy for a moment. She worked with a quiet attention that reminded him of his wife in her younger days, how she had always known the right moment to harvest, not by the calendar, but by the way the orchard felt beneath her hands. He didn't say this aloud, but the thought stayed with him, warm and unhurried. When they had filled their first baskets, they carried them to the bench beneath the old apple tree. The wood was cool in the shade, and the lantern hook above them swayed slightly in the morning breeze. They sat for a while, sipping water from a shared bottle, their knees dusty from the grass. "I used to come out here with my grandmother," Lucy said after a while. "She'd tell me to listen to the trees, that they had a way of telling you which apples wanted to be picked and which ones needed a little more time." Henry nodded. She was right. The orchard talks, if you're willing to hear it. They set out again, moving deeper into the rows. By late morning, the sun was high enough to warm their backs, and the baskets were heavy with fruit. Lucy laughed once when an apple, too eager to be free, slipped from her grasp and landed in the grass with a soft bounce. Henry bent to retrieve it, turning it over in his hand. "It's fine," he said, placing it gently on top of the others. "A little bruise just sweetens the flavor when you cook it." As the day leaned toward noon, they returned to the bench with their final baskets. The shade was deeper now, the breeze carrying with it the faint rustle of leaves from beyond the orchard's edge. They sat in easy silence, the kind that feels as if it has always been there, requiring nothing to keep it alive. Henry looked at the baskets lined up beside them, each one filled to the brim, the apples glowing softly in the filtered light. "They'll keep well," he said, "and the ones that don't will turn into pies or cider. Nothing goes to waste." Lucy smiled, brushing a strand of hair from her forehead. "I think I like the work better than the eating," she admitted. Henry chuckled. "That's the orchard talking again. It likes the care more than the harvest." They lingered a while longer before carrying the baskets toward the house. The path felt different now, lined with the weight of their morning's work, the scent of apples trailing after them. Henry thought about the lantern waiting for its evening hour, how its light would fall across the same path in just a few hours' time. When they reached the porch, they set the baskets in the shade and stood for a moment, looking back toward the orchard. It lay quiet and complete behind them, its branches relieved, its roots deep and content. The day's work had been gentle, steady, and without urgency, the kind of work that left the body pleasantly tired and the mind at peace. Inside, Henry placed 2 apples on the windowsill, where the afternoon sun would warm them. Lucy washed her hands at the sink, the water running clear over her fingers. Neither of them spoke about the evening, but both knew they would meet again in the orchard, when the lantern's light would draw them back to the bench, beneath the old apple tree. And in that quiet understanding, the morning's labor found its perfect rest. The afternoon drifted toward evening in that unhurried way late autumn days sometimes do, with the sun stretching its warmth as if reluctant to let go. Henry had spent the hours after Lucy left arranging the baskets in the cool shade of the back room, setting aside a few apples with slight bruises for cooking. They sat in a wooden bowl on the counter now, catching the last angle of light through the west-facing window, their skins dappled red and gold like the leaves clinging to the far edge of the orchard. He moved about the kitchen without haste, the sounds of his work quiet and deliberate, the tap of a knife on the cutting board, the sigh of the kettle as it reached a low simmer. The air was cool enough that he kept the small stove lit, and the scent of wood smoke mingled with the sweetness of the apples, filling the room with the comfort he hadn't realized he'd missed. The house had been too still for too long, and the soft clatter of bowls, the hum of a recipe remembered, felt like an old friend returning for a visit. Just before the light began to fade, Henry heard the crunch of footsteps on the path. He glanced toward the door and saw Lucy's figure appear, her scarf tucked neatly beneath her coat. In her hands she carried a brown paper parcel tied with string. "I thought you might have room for this," she said, holding it out. Henry took the package and untied the knot, revealing a block of pale butter wrapped in waxed paper. "Fresh from Mrs. Callahan's churn," Lucy explained. "She insisted it would make any pie twice as good." He smiled, setting the butter on the counter. "Well then, we'd best put it to the test tonight." They worked side by side, not in a rush, but with the ease of two people who knew there was enough time for everything. Lucy peeled the apples, her hands moving with a steady rhythm, the curls of skin falling in soft spirals onto the plate beside her. Henry sliced them into even pieces, the knife slipping through the fruit with a quiet, satisfying sound. The bowl filled slowly, each layer sprinkled with sugar, cinnamon, and a pinch of nutmeg, the spices blooming in the warm air. As they worked, the conversation wandered gently, from the way the light had caught on the orchard leaves that morning, to a story about Lucy's grandmother's kitchen, where pies were always baked in pairs because one was never enough for the smell it made. Henry shared how his wife used to sing softly while baking, the tune sometimes changing halfway through without her noticing. "She'd hum something new," he said, "and I'd realize she'd been thinking about another day entirely." When the apples were ready, Lucy rolled out the crust, the dough stretching smooth under the wooden pin. Henry set the lantern on the counter, lighting it early so they could see without the sharp glare of the overhead bulb. The glow softened the kitchen, drawing the edges of things closer as though the walls themselves had leaned in to watch. The pie went into the oven and the waiting began. They sat at the table, hands curled around mugs of tea, the steam carrying a faint echo of the orchard into the room. Outside, the sky turned from pale gold to a deepening blue, the first stars appearing like seeds scattered across a dark field. Henry rose once to tend the fire, adding a log that caught with a low crackle, the sound settling into the room like a heartbeat. When the scent of the pie began to fill every corner of the kitchen, Lucy smiled without looking at Henry. "It's almost unfair," she said, "how something can smell this good before we've even tasted it." He chuckled. "That's the pie's way of making sure we're patient." At last, Henry pulled it from the oven, setting it on the counter where the lantern's light pooled around it. The crust was golden, the edges slightly uneven, but all the more inviting for it. They waited a few minutes, just enough for the filling to settle, before cutting 2 generous slices. The steam curled upward, carrying with it the mingled fragrance of fruit and spice, butter and warmth. They ate slowly, not speaking much, letting the flavors unfold in their own time. The apples were tender without losing their shape, the sweetness balanced with a hint of tartness, the crust flaky enough to break with the side of a fork. It was a simple pie, the kind anyone with a bit of fruit, flour, and patience could make, yet it tasted of something far older and deeper. the orchard's gift made into a shared moment. When their plates were empty, Henry poured more tea and they lingered at the table. The lantern's glow swayed gently as a draft moved through the room, casting soft shadows that danced along the walls. Outside, the orchard was a darker silhouette against the starlit sky, the rows of trees resting after the day's giving. Lucy rose after a while, wrapping her scarf around her neck. "I'll see you tomorrow," she said, and there was a note in her voice that sounded like a promise, though it needed no naming. Henry walked her to the door, the cool night air brushing his face as she stepped onto the path. The lantern in the orchard burned steadily in the distance, its light a quiet echo of the one in his kitchen. He watched until Lucy's figure was lost among the shadows of the trees, then returned inside, the scent of apples and cinnamon still warm in the air. Before turning in for the night, he stepped onto the porch once more, mug in hand, and let his gaze rest on the orchard. The lantern's glow seemed to meet the stars halfway, as if they shared some quiet understanding. And in that light, steady, unassuming, Henry felt the whole of the day gather itself into a kind of peace he hadn't known he'd been missing. The morning came with the kind of rain that seemed less like weather and more like a gentle habit of the sky, steady, quiet, with drops that rolled along the eaves before falling to the soft earth below. Henry woke to the sound of it, a soft tapping that had a way of settling the mind before the day even began. He sat for a while at the edge of the bed, listening, the scent of damp leaves drifting in through the slightly open window. When he made his way to the kitchen, the light outside was dim, filtered through clouds the color of worn wool. The orchard lay just beyond the blur of rain, each tree darkened by the wet, their branches holding a quiet patience. The lantern, still faintly warm from the night before, sat on the counter where he'd left it. It would rest until evening, when its light would once again stretch across the orchard's rows. Henry moved with no urgency, pouring water into the kettle, slicing a piece of bread to toast on the small stove. The warmth of the fire crept slowly into the room, carrying with it the smell of wood smoke that clung to his sleeves. He thought of the baskets of apples in the back room, and how rain always seemed to make their scent richer, as though the cool air coaxed something from their skin. By mid-morning, Lucy appeared at the door, brushing droplets from her hair. She wore a raincoat the color of moss, its shoulders darkened by the steady drizzle. In her hand, she carried a small jar. "Fig jam," she said, holding it out. "I thought it might go well with your bread." Henry smiled, taking the jar from her and setting it on the table. "Come in before the tea goes cold," he said, and she stepped inside, the faint sound of rain following her. They sat together at the table, the window beside them clouded slightly from the warmth inside. The rain kept its steady rhythm, a soft percussion against the roof and leaves. Lucy spread the jam on her toast, the sweetness of figs mingling with the earthy scent of the rain-soaked orchard. "It's the kind of day," she said, "that asks for slow work." Henry nodded. "The orchard's resting, so we should too." After breakfast, they pulled on boots and stepped outside. The grass was cool and damp underfoot, each blade heavy with droplets that brushed against their ankles. They walked the narrow path between the trees, the canopy above offering only partial shelter. Here and there, a drop would fall from the tip of a leaf and land on Henry's shoulder, a brief, cool reminder of the rain's reach. The orchard smelled different in the rain, deeper, almost like the earth itself had exhaled. The apples still on the branches wore a sheen that made their colors richer, the reds deeper, the yellows softer. Lucy reached up to touch one, her fingers leaving a faint print in the condensation before she let it go. They stopped at the old bench beneath the apple tree, the wood darkened by the damp. The lantern hook above it swayed gently, its curve holding a single droplet that quivered but didn't fall. Henry brushed a sleeve across the seat before sitting down, and Lucy joined him, their boots leaving small prints in the softened ground. For a long time, they said nothing. The rain filled the silence without crowding it, the kind of sound that made thought feel unhurried. A bird somewhere in the deeper part of the orchard called once, a brief note before returning to its shelter. Henry leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "When I was a boy," he began, "rain like this meant we'd gather in the shed and sharpen tools. My father always said it was better to prepare on wet days, so the work would be ready when the sun came back." Lucy smiled faintly. "My grandmother used to say the rain was when the earth took its tea, time to sit and soak before growing again." The thought lingered between them, as if it belonged equally to both families. After a while, they rose and walked the outer edge of the orchard. The path curved past a low stone wall, its surface dark and slick with moss. Beyond it, a narrow stream moved with a muted gurgle, swollen just enough to carry leaves along its surface. Henry bent to pick up a fallen branch, its bark soft with rot. He set it aside, clearing the way for the next time the path would be dry. Lucy trailed her hand along the wall, her fingers tracing the uneven shapes of the stones. By the time they returned to the house, the rain had eased to a mist. The clouds had lifted just enough for a pale light to slip through, catching on the wet grass and making it shimmer faintly. Henry hung their coats by the door, and Lucy moved toward the stove to warm her hands. They spent the rest of the afternoon in the kitchen, sorting apples into neat rows, those to keep, those to cook, those to press into cider. The work was simple, almost meditative, each decision made without rush. Outside, the rain finally stopped, leaving the orchard wrapped in a damp stillness that felt like a held breath. As evening approached, Henry carried the lantern to the bench beneath the apple tree. The air was cool, touched with the faint scent of wet leaves and soil. He lit the flame, watching it bloom softly against the deepening dusk. From the porch, Lucy watched as the light began its quiet work, casting a small circle of gold in the silver gray of the orchard. It was the kind of light that didn't ask to be noticed, yet couldn't be ignored once you saw it, like the rain itself, steady and sure, leaving everything softer than before. The rain had passed in the night, leaving behind a morning so clear it felt as if the air had been rinsed. The orchard still wore the dampness of yesterday's softness, but now it shimmered in the sunlight. Each blade of grass carried a bead of water that caught the light and bent it into a quiet sparkle. The trees seemed freshly drawn against the sky, their branches sharper, the last apples hanging with a certain proud weight. Henry stepped onto the porch with his mug, letting the steam rise into the cool air. From here, he could hear the steady drip of water from the eaves, the faint rustle of leaves as a breeze moved through. Somewhere beyond the far row, a pair of crows were calling to each other in that measured way crows do, neither urgent nor hurried. Today would be the first pressing of the season, a ritual Henry had learned as a boy and never outgrown. It wasn't a matter of necessity anymore. He could buy cider at the store if he wanted to, but that wasn't the same. Pressing cider was about the pace of the work, the rhythm of the turning handle, the way the juice ran cloudy and fragrant into the waiting jug. It was about the way the air changed in the orchard afterward, carrying the scent of apples in a way that lingered on the clothes and in the hair. By mid-morning, Lucy arrived with her sleeves rolled, a basket on her arm. Inside were the apples they would set aside for pressing. Some not quite perfect, but rich with flavor. She set the basket down beside the old wooden press, its handle worn smooth from years of use. Henry had cleaned it yesterday, wiping away the dust and setting the tub and tray back in place. The metal screws gleamed faintly in the sun, as if they, too, were ready for the work. "Feels like the right day for it," Lucy said, brushing a leaf from her hair. Henry nodded. "The air's just cool enough to keep the juice sweet." They began by rinsing the apples in a tub of clear water drawn from the pump. Lucy reached in, her fingers moving slowly over the fruit, rubbing away any bits of leaf or soil. The water turned faintly golden from the skins, and the scent of fresh apple rose with every movement. Henry cut each apple into quarters, setting the pieces in a large enamel bowl. The knife's sound against the cutting board was soft and sure, the kind of sound that settles into the background and becomes part of the morning. Lucy fed the pieces into the grinder at the top of the press, turning the handle with a steady rhythm. The crushed fruit fell into the barrel below, a thick, fragrant mash that already carried the promise of cider. They worked without much talk, though now and then Lucy would hum a few bars of a tune Henry couldn't quite place. It reminded him of the way his wife used to hum in the kitchen, sometimes the same melody, sometimes one that changed without warning. The hum seemed to fit the day, neither too bright nor too heavy, just a thread of sound woven through the quiet. When the barrel was full, Henry swung the wooden plate into place and began to turn the press screw. The handle moved slowly at first, then more firmly as the pressure grew. And then, there it was, the first drop falling into the waiting jug, followed by a slow, steady stream. The cider was cloudy and pale gold, with the froth gathering at the top. Lucy crouched to watch it, her hair falling forward over her cheek. "It smells like the orchard," she said softly, "like the part of it you only notice when you stand still long enough." They filled the first jug, then the second, the sunlight catching in the liquid as it settled. Henry wiped the rims with the cloth and set the jugs on the shaded table. They would keep here for the day, the flavor deepening as the hours passed. When the last of the juice had run, they rinsed the press and set it to dry in the sun. Lucy gathered the spent pulp into a basket. It would go to the compost heap at the far edge of the garden. Henry watched her walk the path, the basket swinging lightly in her hand. He liked the way her pace matched the orchard's, unhurried, steady, as though she belonged here, without needing to be told. They poured 2 small glasses of the fresh cider and sat on the bench beneath the apple tree. The lantern hook above them was empty for now, but the shadow of it fell across the table in a thin, curved line. The cider was cool, the sweetness immediate, followed by a hint of sharpness that kept it from being heavy. Lucy set her glass down and leaned back, letting her eyes close for a moment. "This," she said, "feels like a day that won't get away from us, like we'll remember it exactly as it is." Henry looked out over the rows of trees, the sunlight slipping between their branches. "I think some days are made for remembering," he said, "not because something grand happens, but because they fit in your hands just right." They stayed there until the shadows lengthened, the air cooling again. When Lucy left, she carried one of the jugs with her, cradled as if it were something fragile. Henry watched her until she reached the curve in the path, then turned back to the bench. The lantern would be lit soon, and the first pressing of the season would be behind them. But the day's work, and the quiet it left behind, felt like a promise the orchard would keep until the next pressing came. Evening came gently, as if the day had decided it would rather not end too quickly. The sunlight slid low across the orchard, filtering through the branches in long, warm bands. Everywhere it touched, the dampness of the morning seemed to release a faint perfume. The mingled scent of soil, fallen leaves, and the sweet echo of pressed apples from earlier in the day. Henry stood at the porch rail, holding the lantern in both hands. It was still cool to the touch, though he knew it wouldn't be for long. The brass frame caught the last light of the sun, its glass panels reflecting the rows of trees in miniature, as if the whole orchard were folded neatly inside. He made his way down the familiar path, boots brushing through grass that had begun to dry in the late warmth. The air was calm, with just enough breeze to move the leaves in small, unhurried gestures. From time to time, a leaf would drift loose and spiral down, turning slowly before settling in the grass. The bench under the old apple tree waited, darkened by years of weather, its grain softened by time. Henry set the lantern on the hook above it, then struck the match with the care of someone tending not just to a flame, but to an old companion. The wick caught easily, the light blooming with that quiet confidence it had always had. He stood for a moment, watching the glow reach out to the nearest branches, turning the green to gold. The first stars were beginning to appear in the deeper parts of the sky, though the moon had not yet risen. In the soft distance, the orchard seemed to settle itself for the night, the last rustles of small creatures fading into stillness. Henry sat on the bench, resting his elbows on his knees. The lantern's light made a small circle on the ground, catching the edges of fallen apples in the rough texture of the grass. He could smell the cider from earlier, still faintly on his hands, mixed with the smell of the lamp oil. It was a scent that belonged only to evenings like this, part work, part rest, entirely belonging to the season. Not long after, Lucy appeared from the shadowed path between the rows. She was carrying a folded blanket over one arm, and her hair had caught a stray leaf that she didn't seem to notice. "I thought we might sit a while," she said, unfolding the blanket across the bench before joining him. They didn't speak at first. The orchard didn't require it. There was a kind of agreement between them and the place that silence was as much a part of the evening as the light itself. The lantern's flame moved slightly with the air, its reflection dancing in Lucy's eyes. "It smells like the inside of the press," she said after a while. "That mix of sweet and wood and something older." Henry nodded. "It's the older part that lasts. The sweetness fades, but the wood keeps the memory." They watched as the light deepened, the edges of the orchard blurring into the dark. Somewhere beyond the farthest trees, an owl called once, the sound low and certain. The stars multiplied slowly, each one finding its place without hurry. Lucy leaned back, folding her hands in her lap. "When I was little," she said, "my grandfather used to tell me that lanterns didn't just light the ground. They lit whatever memory you needed to see again." She glanced at Henry. "Do you think that's true?" Henry thought about it, his eyes still on the flame. "I think some lights stay lit because someone, somewhere, still remembers why they were lit in the first place." The night eased further in, cool enough now that the blanket was welcome. Lucy pulled it over her knees and Henry adjusted it so it covered them both. The lantern kept its steady glow, unbothered by the dark, unbothered by the quiet. From the porch, the house looked small and far away, its windows dark. Here, beneath the apple tree, the orchard felt like its own small world, one with its own pace, its own boundaries, its own quiet promises. The air was heavy with the scent of ripening apples, the damp soil still holding the day's warmth. Henry knew they would sit here until the lantern's light thinned, or until the chill nudged them back toward the house. But for now, the only work was to watch the light, breathe the air, and let the day end in its own time. And so they stayed, letting the orchard close around them like the slow turning of a page. The first thing Henry noticed when he woke was the pale softness of the light spilling across the ceiling. It wasn't the gold of dawn, nor the gray of rain, but something in between. The muted glow that came when a thin veil of mist had settled in the night. It was the kind of light that made the world quiet before you even opened the door. He swung his legs over the side of the bed, feeling the coolness of the wooden floor against his bare feet. From somewhere in the house, the faint tick of the old wall clock marked the moments in a rhythm slow enough to match his own waking pace. No bird song yet. Even they seemed to be waiting for the mist to lift before announcing the day. Henry dressed without hurry and stepped out onto the porch. The air was damp and cool, heavy with the smell of wet leaves and earth. Beyond the porch rail, the orchard was softened into shades of silver and pale green, the edges of the trees blurred, as if someone had brushed them gently with a fingertip. The grass held onto the night's dew, each blade tipped with a tiny bead that trembled but did not fall. And there, under the old apple tree, the lantern still glowed. It had burned through the night, its flame smaller now but steady, like the last ember in a hearth fire that refuses to die. The light seemed thicker in the mist, its glow not traveling far, but curling close around itself, as if it knew the morning needed gentleness. Henry made his way down the path. The damp grass brushed against his boots, darkening the leather in uneven patches. He passed under the first row of trees, their branches hanging lower in the weight of the mist, and found himself slowing without meaning to. It was as though the orchard wanted him to take each step as an act of care. When he reached the bench, he didn't sit right away. Instead, he stood before the lantern, studying it the way one might study an old photograph, not for what was obvious, but for the way it made the air around it fill. The glass was beaded with tiny drops of moisture, and through them the flame shimmered, bending and shifting with every bead's curve. He reached out and touched the brass frame, feeling the faint warmth that lingered there. And just like that, a memory rose. Not sharp, but complete in its own soft edges. It was years ago, in another morning like this. The mist had been just as heavy and he'd been younger, his hands less marked by the work of time. Beside him had been Claire, her hair pulled into a loose knot at the back of her neck, a wool sweater folded over her arms. She'd been the one to notice the way the mist caught the lantern light, making it seem as though the flame was floating in air. "I think it looks like it's keeping a secret," she'd said, and then she'd smiled. Not the wide smile of greeting, but the small one that carried the weight of something understood. They had stood there for a long time that morning, saying little. The orchard had been theirs in that moment, and the light had been part of the language they didn't need to speak aloud. Henry let the memory settle back where it had come from, not trying to hold it too tightly. He had learned over the years that some moments lived best when they could come and go like this, unforced, returning when the air and the light allowed them. He sat down on the bench, the wood cool under his palms. The mist moved slowly, almost imperceptibly, as though the whole orchard were breathing in long, even draws. The lantern's glow reached the edge of his boots, warm against the dampness in the air. From here, he could hear the faintest trickle of water from the creek beyond the back field. It was a sound so quiet that if he had been anywhere else, he might have missed it entirely. But here, it joined the other small voices of the morning. The creak of a branch shifting under the weight of dew, the rustle of a leaf settling against another, the far-off murmur of a cow lowing in the neighboring pasture. He stayed there until the mist began to thin, the shapes of the orchard sharpening little by little. The lantern's light, once wrapped in silver air, began to pale in the growing day. Henry reached up and turned down the wick, the flame narrowing before it went out with a soft sigh. For a moment, the smoke curled upward in a thin thread, then disappeared into the cool air. The day would carry its own work, but Henry knew that what stayed with him would be this: the quiet, the mist, and the way the lantern had looked like it was holding a story just for him before the world fully woke. He lifted the lantern from its hook and began the slow walk back to the house, the orchard opening itself again with each step. Somewhere behind him, the bench waited, holding the shape of the morning in its grain until the next time the mist would return. By the time the sun had risen high enough to touch the tops of the apple trees, the mist had thinned into nothing more than a pale suggestion in the air. Henry had finished his first cup of coffee on the porch, the mug warm between his hands long after the steam had faded. The orchard stretched out before him in its usual stillness, the kind of quiet that wasn't empty but full of the gentle work of living things going about their day. He decided it was a good morning for tending to the garden along the east side of the house. It wasn't large, just a handful of beds edged with old cedar boards, holding herbs, a few rows of late beans, and some fading marigolds that had kept the pests at bay through summer. The soil here was different from the orchard, darker and looser, rich from years of turning and resting again. Henry fetched his gloves from the peg by the kitchen door and made his way to the beds. The grass along the edges was damp from the night, and the faint scent of rosemary drifted up as he brushed past the herbs. He knelt down near the far corner where the marigolds were leaning into the last of their bloom. With slow, steady motions, he began to pull the weeds that had crept in while his attention had been elsewhere. It was in this quiet, with his hands moving more from memory than thought, that he felt the edge of something hard beneath the soil. Not a stone, he knew the feel of those, but the rounded handle of wood, softened by time. He brushed away the dirt with care, revealing the short, curved blade of an old garden trowel. The metal was dulled to a matte gray, its once sharp edge worn smooth. The wooden handle bore the faint impressions of fingers, as if it had been held so often it had taken on the memory of a hand. Henry sat back on his heels, turning it over slowly. He hadn't seen this trowel in years, maybe not since before Claire had fallen ill. It had been hers. She'd kept it on a hook by the shed door, along with a basket for gathering herbs. The sight of it brought her back not in a rush, but in that slow, steady way memories came when they were ready. The image of her crouched over the thyme, hair falling forward, one hand steadying the plant while the other worked the soil. She had always said that herbs needed to know your hands before they'd grow well for you. It wasn't the kind of advice you'd find in a gardening book, but Claire believed it, and Henry had to admit, the rosemary had never been as full as it had in those years when she'd tended it herself. He ran his thumb along the groove in the handle where her fingers must have rested countless times. There was a comfort in the weight of it, not because it was heavy, but because it was familiar. It was a reminder that the life they had built here was made not of grand gestures, but of small daily acts, planting, tending, waiting, and returning. Henry set the trowel on the edge of the garden bed and continued his work, pulling the weeds more carefully now, as though Claire might still be watching to see that he did it right. A breeze moved through, carrying with it the faint sound of the creek beyond the field. Somewhere in the orchard, a branch shifted, dropping an apple that landed softly in the grass. When the bed was clear, he sat back again, looking at the space with the kind of quiet satisfaction that came from order restored. The marigolds seemed to stand a little straighter without the weeds crowding their stems. He picked up the trowel once more, brushing off the last of the dirt before carrying it to the shed. Inside, the air was cool and smelled faintly of cedar and oil. The hook where the trowel had once hung was still there, though it had gone unused for years. Henry hung it back in its place, feeling a small but steady rightness in seeing it there again. It wasn't about using it, though he might in time, but about knowing it was where it belonged. He lingered in the shed for a moment, letting his eyes trace the other tools, each one holding its own quiet history. The rake with the splintered handle, the spade with a nick in its edge from striking stone, the coil of twine that had outlasted more seasons than he could count. All of it was part of the same slow, faithful rhythm that had shaped his days here. When he stepped back outside, the sun had warmed the garden and the smell of earth was stronger. Henry stood for a moment, breathing it in, the trowel's memory resting gently in his hands, even now that it was back on its hook. The day still held its work. Apples to gather, wood to stack, but he felt no rush. Some mornings gave you something more than the tasks themselves, and this was one of them. It had given him a piece of the past to carry into the rest of the day, a reminder that tending to the present often meant tending to what had been left behind. And so he turned toward the orchard, walking slowly as if each step might stir another memory, waiting patiently beneath the surface of things. The orchard was warm now, the sun filtering through the late morning branches in soft, shifting patches. Each step Henry took seemed to disturb a little cloud of scent, apples ripening, grass warming, and the faint sweetness of clover that had crept in among the rows. He carried a shallow wicker basket in one hand, its weave loose enough for light to pass through and make small diamond shapes on the ground as he walked. The trees were heavy with fruit. Some apples hung low enough to brush against his shoulder as he passed, their skins cool and taut from the night's moisture. Others had already dropped, resting in the grass with the kind of quiet surrender, their color deepening in the sun. Henry stopped now and then to turn one over in his palm, checking for bruises, weighing the decision of whether it should go into the basket or back to the soil. He worked without hurry, letting his mind wander the way it only could when his hands were busy with something simple. The sound of the apples settling into the basket was gentle, a muffled thump softened by the weave and the lining of an old tea towel he'd folded inside. The towel had been Claire's choice years ago when she told him that bare wicker could scratch the skin of fruit. He'd teased her at the time for her fussiness, but he hadn't picked apples without that towel since. Now and then a breeze would pass through, loosening a leaf or two to drift down beside him. The air was warm but not heavy, touched with that first hint of autumn that carried a sharper edge in the mornings and evenings. It was the kind of day that invited you to linger in it, to measure time by the arc of the sun rather than the hands of a clock. Henry was reaching for an apple high in the branches when he heard it. The soft, deliberate crunch of footsteps on the grass. It wasn't the hurried tread of someone with business to attend to, nor the uneven steps of a stranger unsure of their way. It was a steady, familiar sound, like a page turning in a well-loved book. "Morning, Henry," came a voice from between the rows. Lucy appeared, her hands tucked into the pockets of a faded cardigan, her hair gathered loosely at the nape of her neck. She always seemed to walk as though she were listening to the ground, letting it tell her how quickly to move. Henry smiled and shifted the basket to his other hand. "Morning, Lucy. You've caught me in the middle of robbing the trees." She stepped closer, pausing to run her fingers along the bark of one trunk as she passed. "They don't seem to mind. Looks like they've given you more than you can carry." He glanced down at the basket, already half full, the reds and golds of the apples bright against the tea towel. "Plenty to share," he said, and then, because it was habit between them, "You've come for the lantern, haven't you?" Lucy smiled, a small curve at the corner of her mouth. "Not just for the lantern, but I did notice it was burning last night." She reached out and took one of the apples from the basket, turning it in her hands as though it might tell her something about the tree it had come from. "It always burns," Henry said, his voice low, not out of secrecy but because the orchard seemed to ask for quiet. They walked together between the rows, Henry stopping now and then to reach into the branches. Lucy didn't hurry him. She never did. She would crouch to pick up a fallen apple, examine it, and either keep it or lay it gently back in the grass. Every movement she made carried the same unspoken care that Henry recognized in himself. The understanding that tending a place meant listening to it more than working at it. When they reached the far end of the row, they sat on the low stone wall that marked the orchard's boundary. The basket rested between them, and the sun warmed the backs of their hands where they lay idle on their knees. For a long time, they didn't speak, just watched the light shift over the grass and the slow drift of a hawk circling far above the fields. Lucy was the one to break the silence. "I think the lantern feels different in autumn," she said. Henry nodded, knowing exactly what she meant without asking her to explain. The light in autumn seemed to belong more to memory than to need. Not just a guide in the dark, but a keeper of something softer, something that didn't fade with the dawn. They stayed there until the sun leaned far enough west to lengthen the shadows in the orchard. When they rose, Henry lifted the basket and felt the easy weight of it in his hands. Lucy took one last apple from the top, polished it on her sleeve, and smiled at him before turning down the path toward her own home. Henry watched her go, the sound of her footsteps fading into the quiet. Then he turned back toward the house, the basket balanced against his hip, the orchard stretching wide and calm around him. Somehow, the air felt a little warmer, as though the morning's mist had left behind a softness that the day was in no hurry to lose. Henry's steps were slow as he left the orchard, the basket of apples cradled against his side. The path from the trees to the house was one he could have walked with his eyes closed, every rise and dip of the ground memorized over years. The sun was leaning just past its highest point now, and the warmth on his shoulders carried that soft, slanting quality that only came when summer was loosening its grip. He passed the row of lavender along the fence, brushing one plant lightly with the back of his hand. The fragrance rose in a small cloud, mingling with the faint sharpness of the apples. Inside, the kitchen held the coolness of shaded walls and the lingering smell of last night's tea. Henry set the basket on the worn pine table, the tea towel falling open to reveal the glossy skins, each apple reflecting a different piece of the light coming through the window. He stood for a moment, simply looking at them, not because he needed to count or sort them, but because they seemed like small treasures gathered from the morning. He knew what he would make before he even lifted the first one. Claire had always said the first pie of the season set the tone for the weeks to come. If it was made with care, crust rolled without hurry, filling spice just enough, then the autumn ahead would be generous. Henry wasn't sure he believed in that kind of magic, but he had learned that sometimes the act of believing was enough. He took a deep breath and began. The apples were firm under the knife, their pale flesh crisp and fragrant. He worked at a steady pace, the slices fallen into the waiting bowl, each one releasing a little more of that clean, sweet scent. The rhythm of it was comforting. Cut, turn, cut again. It was the same motion he had used every year, the kind that lived in the muscles as much as in the mind. Once the fruit was ready, he reached for the tin of cinnamon from the high shelf. Its lid gave a soft click, and the air filled with a warmth that seemed to settle deeper than scent alone. A pinch of nutmeg followed, then a dusting of sugar, stirred in until the slices were coated in a gentle glaze. He could almost hear Claire's voice reminding him not to overdo it. "The apples should speak for themselves," she would say, smiling over the edge of her mug. The dough waited in its bowl, cool and pliable. Henry rolled it out on the floured board, the pin moving in long, slow passes. He thought about how Claire's hands had always seemed to coax the dough into place, never forcing it. He tried to follow that example, easing it into the pie dish, letting it fall where it wanted. When the filling was poured in, the apples settled with a faint sigh, as though relieved to be where they belonged. He laid the top crust over them, cutting a few small slits for the steam to escape. The edges were crimped with the back of a fork, the pattern uneven in places but steady in intent. The oven, already warmed, took the pie with a low hum. Henry set the timer but knew he would judge it more by smell than by minutes. He cleaned the board, rinsed the knife, and wiped the table, each task done with the same care as the baking itself. By the time he sank into the chair by the window, the first hint of baking apples was in the air. Outside, the orchard rested in its midday quiet. The lantern in the far corner, unlit now, caught the light in its glass, a small glint that was easy to miss unless you were looking for it. Henry let his eyes rest there, the image settling into him like a familiar chord. As the pie baked, the kitchen filled with a fragrance that seemed to draw in the rest of the day. The crispness of the morning air, the warmth of the sun on the path, the quiet company of Lucy in the orchard. It was a scent that carried not only the present moment, but all the other autumn afternoons that had led to this one. When he finally opened the oven door, the crust was golden, the edges just beginning to deepen in color. He set the pie on the counter, and the soft crackle of cooling filled the kitchen. It was a small sound, but Henry listened to it as though it were a voice speaking directly to him. He didn't cut into it right away. The first pie of the season was meant to be shared, and though Lucy had not said she would return, Henry suspected she might. He set another chair by the table, laid 2 plates beside it, and placed a folded napkin at each place. Outside, the shadows were lengthening across the orchard. Henry poured himself a small cup of tea, its steam curling upward into the warm air, and sat where he could see the path from the trees. If she came, he thought, they would eat together in the soft light of late afternoon, and if she didn't, there would still be tomorrow, and the day after, and the quiet comfort of knowing the pie was there, waiting. The afternoon slipped by quietly, the kind of slow hours that seemed to hum just beneath the edge of sound. Henry remained by the window, his tea cooling in his hands, the pie resting on the counter with its warm scent seeping into every corner of the house. Outside, the orchard had shifted into the gentler light of late day. The gold in the leaves deepened, the shadows stretched longer, and the air carried a subtle coolness. Not enough to call for a sweater yet, but enough to make you aware that evening was drawing near. He listened to the faint ticking quiet of the room, the occasional creak from the cooling pie tin, the sigh of the kettle as it settled on stove, the distant murmur of leaves catching a breeze. It was in these small sounds that Henry always felt most at home. They were the kind of sounds you didn't notice unless you'd lived long enough in a place to let them sink into your bones. The light outside softened into amber. It was the hour when the house seemed to grow warmer in color, as though the walls themselves were remembering every other evening they had held. Henry poured himself another cup of tea, the steam curling up in slow spirals. He thought about cutting into the pie, just a small slice, enough to take the edge off his curiosity, but he left it untouched. It didn't feel right to begin without Lucy, and as though the thought had been an invitation, he heard the soft crunch of footsteps along the path from the orchard. Not hurried, not hesitant, just steady, in the rhythm of someone who knew where they were going and saw no reason to rush. Henry set down his cup and stood, moving to the door. When he opened it, the cooler air met him first, and then Lucy appeared, her cardigan pulled closer around her shoulders. The light caught the edges of her hair, turning them into a muted halo. "I thought I might find you here," she said, a small smile lifting the words. "You guessed right," Henry replied, "and you've come just in time." She stepped into the kitchen, her eyes going at once to the pie on the counter. The scent was richer now, its warmth mingling with the faint trace of lavender from the open window. Lucy drew in a slow breath, the kind that made her shoulders lift just slightly before settling again. "That smells like every September I've ever loved," she said. Henry chuckled. "Then we'd better not waste it." He fetched 2 plates from the cupboard, the porcelain faintly cool against his fingers, and set them on the table. The knife moved cleanly through the crust, the sound soft but distinct, a crispness giving way to tender fruit. Steam rose as he lifted the first slice, carrying the mingled scents of cinnamon and apple into the space between them. They ate slowly, not out of restraint, but because the moment seemed to ask for it. The pie was warm, the crust flaky, the apples yielding without losing their shape. Lucy closed her eyes for a moment after her first bite, as though storing the taste somewhere she could come back to later. "It's the tea towel, isn't it?" she said eventually, glancing toward the empty basket still resting on the counter. "Claire's trick. It keeps the apples from bruising." Henry nodded, a small ache passing through his chest, though not the kind that made him turn away. "Yes," he said quietly. "I can't seem to pick them without it." They fell into a comfortable silence, the kind that left space for both memory and presence. Outside, the orchard was fading into the blue of evening, the lantern still dark but waiting. The first calls of crickets began in the grass, their rhythm blending with the faint sound of the wind touching the branches. When their plates were empty, Henry poured 2 more cups of tea. They lingered at the table, speaking now and then, not of anything pressing, but of small things. The way the light looked different this year, the neighbor's dog who had taken to napping under the old maple, the stubborn rose bush near the fence that refused to give up blooming. As the last of the daylight slipped from the windows, Henry rose to light the lantern. The match flared briefly, then settled into a steady flame behind the glass. The warm glow reached the edges of the kitchen, softening the corners, making the air itself feel thicker and more certain. Lucy watched him, her hands folded around her cup. "It's a good light," she said, and Henry could tell she wasn't just talking about the lantern. They didn't speak of parting yet. There was still time before she would stand, pull her cardigan closer, and walk the path back through the orchard. For now, they sat together in the warmth, the lantern burning between them, the scent of apples and cinnamon still curling through the air, like a thread that tied the whole day together. The night had been waiting patiently all along, just beyond the edges of the light. By the time Lucy set her cup down for the last time, the windows were filled with the deepening blue of early darkness. The lantern on the table burned steadily, casting a golden circle around them, and in that circle the warmth felt complete, not as though it needed to last forever, but as though it belonged entirely to this moment. "I should head home before the chill sets in," Lucy said softly, her voice carrying no rush. Henry nodded, not out of agreement so much as understanding. Some departures weren't hurried, they happened in their own good time. He stood, reaching for her cardigan draped over the back of the chair, and held it for her as she slipped it on. The wool was faintly scented with the orchard, the way clothes gather the air when you've been walking through grass and trees. She buttoned the top 2 buttons, leaving the rest open, and Henry could see the faint rise and fall of her breath as she adjusted the collar against her neck. They stepped outside together, the door giving a quiet click behind them. The coolness of the night was immediate, a gentle but certain reminder that autumn was already in the air. The path to the orchard lay ahead, its gravel softened by a scatter of fallen leaves that whispered underfoot. Henry carried the lantern, its glow moving with them, brushing light onto the nearby trunks and sending long shadows across the ground. The trees seemed taller at night, their branches stretching upward like silhouettes against the deeper dark. Every now and then a breeze would move through them, and the leaves, still holding most of their green, would shiver with a sound almost like rain. They didn't speak much as they walked. The quiet was not awkward but companionable, shaped by all the shared silences of years past. Henry could remember other nights like this, walking with Claire after an evening with neighbors, carrying a lantern home while the air smelled of hay and cool earth. The memory was gentle now, no longer edged with the sharpness of loss, as though time had laid its hand over it in kindness. Halfway through the orchard, Lucy paused. She tilted her head slightly, listening. Far off, perhaps at the edge of the pasture, a barn owl called, low, deliberate, as though speaking to the darkness itself. They both stood still for a moment, letting the sound carry over them. "It always makes me feel as though someone else is keeping watch," Lucy said quietly. Henry smiled in the half-light. It's been here longer than we have, probably knows the orchard better than either of us. They walked on, the lantern swinging lightly in Henry's hand. Its light caught the curve of the apples still hanging in the trees, some glowing faintly red, others pale like moons tucked into the branches. The air smelled of cool fruit and the faint sweetness of damp grass. When they reached the end of the orchard, the path split, one way leading back to Henry's porch, the other toward the lane that would take Lucy home. They stopped at the place where the two paths met, the lantern casting their shadows long behind them. "Thank you for the pie," Lucy said. Her smile was small but full, the kind that stayed in her eyes as much as on her lips. "Thank you for sharing it," Henry replied. For a moment, neither of them moved. The air was still, save for the soft rustle of a branch somewhere above them. Then Lucy stepped back onto her path, and Henry lifted the lantern higher so its light would follow her a little way. He stood there until the shape of her cardigan faded into the dark, and the sound of her footsteps became the sound of the leaves shifting in the breeze. Only then did he turn back toward the house, the lantern's light leading him through the familiar rows. When he reached the porch, he set the lantern down on the top step and looked back. The orchard was quiet again, but not empty. Its stillness seemed to hold the echo of their walk, the warmth of shared tea, the scent of cinnamon still clinging to the air. Inside, the kitchen greeted him with its soft, settled warmth. The pie dish sat on the counter, 2 slices missing, as though marking the presence of something that would remain long after the taste was gone. Henry poured himself a final cup of tea, the steam rising gently in the glow of the lantern, and sat at the table. The night deepened outside, the crickets steady in their chorus. Somewhere far off, the owl called again, and Henry felt a quiet certainty that the orchard, and the people it had brought together, were in safe keeping. The house had grown still after Lucy's departure. Henry sat at the kitchen table, hands folded loosely around his mug. The tea had cooled by now, but he didn't mind. Sometimes it was enough simply to hold something warm, to feel the faint comfort it carried, even if the taste no longer lingered. The lantern set on the counter beside him gave off its quiet glow. It wasn't the kind of light that hurried you. It asked nothing more than that you sit and keep it company. In its circle of gold, the edges of the room softened. The walls seemed to lean in a little, not to crowd him, but to keep the night air at bay. His eyes drifted to the flame, and without deciding to, he found himself traveling backward in time. It was an autumn decades ago, long before the orchard had reached its full height, when the trees were still young and thin-limbed, their roots not yet deep enough to hold the ground as they did now. The lantern had been new then, a gift from Claire's father. Henry could still see the way the brass shone that first evening, the way Claire had run her fingers along its handle before lifting it from the box. They had just finished building the bench under the old apple tree, the one that had already been standing before either of them was born. It seemed right to christen both the bench and the lantern on the same night. That evening had been colder than this one, the air carrying the crisp scent of frost even before the sun had gone down. Claire had made a pot of stew, thick with potatoes and carrots from their garden. They'd eaten by the kitchen fire, the sound of the wind slipping under the eaves as steady as a metronome. When the dishes were done, Claire had wrapped herself in her wool shawl and followed Henry out into the dark. The lantern's light felt almost too bright at first, cutting through the shadowed rows like a promise. Every step they took seemed to open a little more of the orchard ahead of them, as though the light were drawing a path that hadn't existed before. At the bench they had sat close, sharing the same folded blanket. Claire had rested her head on his shoulder, and the lantern's glow had caught the faint silver in her hair. Silver that wasn't there in the sun, but appeared only under this kind of light. They had spoken of small things, whether the last of the apples would hold through the week, whether the north field might be ready for planting in spring, whether they should invite the neighbors for cider once the press was set up again. The lantern's flame had leaned gently in the breeze, but never wavered enough to go out. When the cold grew sharper, they walked home, and Henry remembered looking back to see the light still burning in the orchard. A small star caught among the branches. It was then that Claire had said something he'd carried ever since. "It's not the size of the light that matters, Henry. It's what it makes you see while it's burning." Back in the present, Henry let the memory settle in him, not with the ache it once had, but with the steadiness of something that had been loved and well lived. The lantern still burned on the counter, its brass no longer shining like it had in that first autumn, but worn to a softer glow, the kind that came only from years of use. He took another sip of tea, the flavor faint but still there. Outside, the orchard rested under the same stars it had known for generations, the branches holding the cool night in their stillness. And somewhere between the flicker of the flame and the quiet of the trees, Henry felt as though that first autumn had never really ended. It had simply been folded into all the others, each year adding its own layer of light. Henry sat for a while longer at the table, the lantern's glow casting a quiet pulse across the wood grain. The tea in his cup had long gone cold, but he held it as though the warmth might return if he waited long enough. Eventually he rose, not with the thought of doing anything particular, but simply because his body knew it was time to move. He lifted the lantern, feeling the familiar weight in his hand, and walked toward the front door. The hinges gave their soft sigh as he opened it, letting the night breathe into the house. The air that met him on the porch was not the same as it had been earlier. It carried with it the faintest thread of change, not yet the sharpness of true autumn, but something leaning in that direction. It was as if the season had sent its first gentle messenger ahead, whispering of what was to come. Henry stepped out, the boards beneath his feet creaking in quiet recognition. He set the lantern on the railing, where its circle of light brushed over the steps and spilled a little way onto the path. Beyond that, the darkness of the orchard gathered itself, unbroken except for the pale wash of starlight on the higher branches. A breeze moved through the leaves, and he heard it, that small but telling difference in the sound. In summer, the wind carries the fullness of leaves, their voices broad and open like laughter in a sunlit room. But tonight, the rustle had thinned, carrying a dry edge, as though each leaf had aged slightly in just a few hours, turning the corner toward their final days. He rested both hands on the railing and leaned forward a little. From here, he could see the faint curve of the lane where Lucy had walked home earlier. It was quiet now, but the memory of her cardigan's pale outline against the dark lingered in his mind, like a note from a song you keep humming without realizing it. Somewhere at the edge of the orchard, he noticed a small flicker. It wasn't the lantern's light. This was fainter, cooler, a firefly out of season. He watched it rise and fall in the air, its glow hesitant, as if it wasn't quite sure whether it belonged to summer or autumn. It drifted closer, the lantern's warmth seeming to draw it in before it vanished into the dark again. Henry smiled at the thought, how even the smallest signs carried their own quiet significance. The change of seasons was never a sudden thing. It crept in with such gentleness that most people missed it entirely. But out here, with nothing to crowd the senses, you could feel it settling around you, leaf by leaf, breath by breath. The boards under his feet cooled slowly, the night pressing its way into the wood. He thought of the first autumn he'd noticed the same shift, years ago when Claire had stepped out to join him. She'd been holding 2 mugs of cider, steam curling up into the lantern light, and she had said, almost to herself, "It's coming." When he'd asked what she meant, she only smiled and tilted her head toward the orchard, as if the trees themselves had already told her. He stayed there for a long while, listening, not just to the wind, but to the stillness between the sounds, the kind of stillness that made you aware of your own breathing, of the way your heart found a steady rhythm in the dark. Every so often the owl called again from its post near the far fence, its voice low and certain, as though marking the hours for all who lived within earshot. When at last he reached for the lantern, its metal was faintly warm beneath his fingers. He lifted it, turning back toward the door, but not before casting one last glance across the orchard. In the shifting air, he thought he could see the faint glimmer of apples in the nearest row, not the bright reds and golds of harvest yet, but a promise waiting quietly in the dark. As he stepped inside, the door closed with a sound that felt more like a pause than an ending. The night, with all its small changes, would go on without him, but he carried a piece of it with him, folded neatly into the soft fabric of memory. Henry set the lantern back on the kitchen table, where its steady glow softened the corners of the room. He didn't light the overhead lamp. It felt too sharp for this hour. Instead, he let the golden circle from the lantern rest over the worn boards, the stack of dishes by the sink, and the neat pile of apples Lucy had brought earlier in the week. The apples sat in a shallow wicker basket on the counter, their skins catching the light like polished wood. Some were a deep, almost wine red. Others were paler, with hints of gold blushing through. Henry reached for one, turning it slowly in his palm, feeling the faint waxiness of its skin and the cool firmness beneath. He could tell, just from the weight, that it would be crisp when cut, the kind of apple that kept its shape in the oven. There was a quiet kind of purpose to the thought. Baking at night was something he had taken to doing in the years since Claire had passed. Not every night, only when the air felt just cool enough to carry the scent through the house, or when the orchard's hush seemed to ask for company. It wasn't about hunger, not really. It was about the way the warm, spiced air filled the rooms, softening the edges of silence. He pulled a cutting board closer, the familiar scrape of wood against the countertop, a sound he'd heard for decades. From the drawer, he took the small paring knife with the worn handle, the one Claire had favored. The blade was still sharp, its edge glinting faintly in the lantern light. As he cut, the apples gave that tender, almost shy scent, the kind that feels fresher at night, as if the darkness draws it closer. The pieces fell into a wide ceramic bowl, each slice pale and clean, their surfaces catching the glow for a moment before they dulled. He worked slowly, not out of necessity, but because there was no need to rush. The rhythm of it was its own comfort, the lift of the knife, the gentle press through flesh, the quiet tap as each piece landed in the bowl. Outside, the wind had stilled. Through the open window, the orchard seemed to be listening. The night air leaned in, carrying with it the faintest sweetness from the rows of fruit. A scent that was more memory than aroma, but no less real for it. Once the apples were ready, he sprinkled them with sugar, a little cinnamon, and a pinch of nutmeg. The spices rose instantly, warm and familiar, like the opening notes of an old song. He stirred them gently, the wooden spoon turning through the slices with a muffled scrape. Each motion released more of that mingled fragrance, the sugar drawing out the juice so that it pooled faintly at the bottom of the bowl. The oven gave its quiet tick as it heated, its sound blending into the hum of the lantern's flame. Henry pulled out the round baking dish, lining it with the pastry he had made earlier in the day. He laid the apple slices inside, arranging them in loose layers, letting them settle where they wanted rather than forcing them into order. There was a kind of honesty in a pie that wasn't too neat, as though it was more interested in being eaten than being admired. When the top crust was in place, he pressed its edges down with the tines of a fork, leaving small, even marks like tracks in fresh snow. A few careful slits in the center would let the steam escape, curling into the air as it baked. He slid the dish into the oven, the heat blooming out against his face for a moment before the door closed. The kitchen began to change almost immediately. The coolness in the air retreated, replaced by the slow spread of warmth from the oven. It was the kind of warmth that didn't just stay in the room. It found its way into the bones, into the quiet spaces of the mind. Henry leaned against the counter, arms folded loosely, and let himself breathe it in. In the stillness, he thought of the nights when Claire would bake and he would sit at the table, half reading the paper, half watching her move about the kitchen. She had a way of working that seemed less like preparing food and more like tending to something alive, as though the pie itself needed her company to become whole. He had never quite managed to capture that same quality, but perhaps, he thought, that wasn't the point. It was enough to keep the practice alive, to let the act itself be the remembrance. Minutes passed. The crust began to color, the scent deepening into something both sweet and faintly earthy. It mingled with the faint coolness drifting from the open window, a meeting of seasons in the air. Henry closed his eyes for a moment, listening to the soft tick of the oven, the almost imperceptible sighs of the orchard outside. When the pie was done, he set it on the table to cool. Steam rose from the slits in the crust, curling into the lantern's light before dissolving into the air, and he didn't cut it, not yet. There was comfort in simply knowing it was there, whole and unbroken, the promise of warmth held within. Henry sat back down, his hands folded loosely on the table. The lantern glowed beside the pie, the two of them keeping their quiet vigil in the kitchen's heart. Somewhere beyond the orchard, the night was stretching itself into the deeper hours, but here, time had folded into something smaller, more tender. It was the kind of moment you didn't rush, the kind that stayed with you long after the light had gone out. Henry let the pie rest on the table while the lantern kept its soft vigil. The kitchen felt warmer now, not only from the oven's lingering heat, but from the sense that something had been completed. A small, honest task that gave the night a center. He stood for a while, palms resting lightly on the table's edge, watching the steam curl from the slits in the crust. Beyond the window, the orchard was draped in stillness. The air had a density to it, the kind that comes in late summer's edge when the day's warmth refuses to fully leave. The leaves, though quiet, held a faint shimmer from the lantern's light spilling outward. Here and there, The round outlines of apples could be guessed at, their surfaces catching the smallest glints before vanishing back into shadow. Henry thought about leaving the pie until morning, but the night was too generous to put it off. He fetched a plate, one of the old cream-colored ones with a faded green rim, and a fork with a slight bend near its neck, an imperfection he had never bothered to fix. With the knife he cut into the pie, the crust giving way in a gentle flake, releasing a deeper rush of cinnamon and baked fruit. He placed a single slice on the plate, letting the filling settle, the syrupy edges pooling just enough to glisten in the lantern light. He didn't take it to the kitchen table. Instead, he carried the plate toward the back door, unhooking the screen with its familiar click and stepping out onto the porch. The lantern came with him. Its light shifted the night in small circles as he walked, pulling the world a little closer. On the porch, he set it down on the railing, its glow reaching into the steps below and partway across the nearest row of grass. The chair was waiting, the same old wooden one, with its paint worn to a soft gray from years of weather. Henry lowered himself into it, feeling the boards beneath him creak in greeting. From here, he could see the orchard stretch out in quiet order, the trees like patient sentinels. He took a bite of pie, slow enough that the warmth could unfurl across his tongue. It was sweet, yes, but not in a hurried way. The kind of sweetness that carries the coolness of the night air with it, a balance between comfort and freshness. The cinnamon lingered, and beneath it, the faint tang of the apples as they had been when first picked. A night breeze lifted just enough to brush against his cheek and move a strand of hair across his forehead. It brought with it a mingled scent, the faint spice from the pie, the dry grass of late summer, and the subtle green note of apple leaves. It was a scent that couldn't be bottled or kept, but it was also one that would never be forgotten. Somewhere in the orchard, an owl called once, low, measured, as if speaking only to itself. Henry paused his fork mid-air, listening. The sound didn't disturb the peace. Rather, it seemed to deepen it, like a single line of melody in a song that had been playing all along. The lantern's glow pooled on the railing, its edges soft and uneven. Moths began to drift in and out of that circle, their wings catching the light in pale flashes before vanishing again into the dark. Henry watched them without hurry, each movement a small, wordless story. He leaned back in the chair, letting the plate rest on his knee. His gaze traveled upward, beyond the orchard, to where the sky opened itself in a quilt of stars. They were steady tonight, not blurred by cloud or haze, and their quiet company felt as familiar as any neighbor's. He remembered evenings like this from years ago, when Claire would sit beside him, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea, the two of them speaking only now and then. They didn't need words for those moments. The orchard, the porch, and the sky said enough. In the stillness, Henry could almost feel her there again, the way her arm would rest lightly against his. Another bite of pie, another slow breath of night air. The warmth of the lantern seemed to hold both past and present at once, bridging the gap without asking him to choose between them. The sweetness of the apples, the creak of the chair, the hush of the orchard, each piece of the evening fitting into place like threads in a well-worn quilt. As the minutes passed, Henry felt the weight in his chest ease. It wasn't gone. Grief never truly left, but it had shifted into something quieter, something that could sit with him without pressing so hard. He let his eyes wander over the rows of trees once more, then down to the pie, then back to the lantern. The night had reached that hour where time itself felt less certain. It could be midnight or just past 10. The difference didn't matter. What mattered was this small world, lit by the lantern, bound by the porch, and kept company by the orchard's gentle breathing. Henry set his fork down, content to simply hold the plate and let the scent rise from it. He would finish the pie soon enough, but for now it was enough to be here, under the lantern's quiet glow, while the rest of the world lay folded in shadow. The morning after the rain came gently, as though the sky had learned something overnight and was now willing to let the earth rest. The orchard, still damp from the night's shower, wore a freshness that made the air seem almost drinkable. Each blade of grass, every apple leaf, glistened with its own small bead of water, catching the pale light in a way that made the whole place look like it had been dusted with silver. The lantern, though unlit in the daylight, still held a faint scent of the oil and smoke that had kept it alive through the long hours of darkness. Jonathan stood on the porch a little longer than usual that morning. He had no urgent task pulling him away. The fields beyond the orchard shimmered faintly in the sun's first rise, and he could hear the creek, swollen slightly from the rain, murmuring in its steady, contented way. A few birds, perhaps reassured by the gentler air, began their tentative songs. It was the sort of morning that asked nothing from him except his attention, and he was willing to give it. When he finally stepped down onto the grass, the dampness soaked gently into the soles of his boots, reminding him of mornings from his boyhood, when he'd wake to find the earth soft and forgiving underfoot. He thought of his mother then, the way she'd hang sheets on the line after a rain, believing the air made them smell cleaner, sweeter. She'd hum while she worked, a tune that had no name but seemed to fit perfectly with the slow rhythm of the cloth swaying in the breeze. He found himself walking the familiar path to the orchard without deciding to go there. His hands brushed along the tall grass, and each step stirred the scent of damp earth. The lantern's post came into view, its base darkened where the rain had run down the wood. Up close he could see the small droplets still clinging to its frame. He rested a hand on the post for a moment, feeling the coolness of the metal, and thought again of how long it had been here. Long before him, long before so much else had changed. That morning, he didn't bother to bring tools or a basket. He simply wandered between the rows of apple trees, noting how the rain had deepened the colors, the bark darker, the fruit more vivid against the green leaves. Some apples had fallen, their skins bruised, but they gave off a sweetness that drew bees and made the air richer. He paused beneath one tree, one he had always favored without quite knowing why. The trunk had a curve to it, as though it had bent slightly to meet the light. He leaned against it, feeling the roughness of the bark through his shirt, and let his thoughts drift. This was a tree his father had planted, he remembered suddenly. The realization came without fanfare, as if the knowledge had been waiting quietly in the back of his mind all along. His father had set the young sapling in the ground one spring, years before Jonathan was tall enough to reach its lowest branch. He thought of that day, his father's steady hands pressing soil around the roots, his quiet voice explaining how a tree needed more than water and sun. It needed patience and a kind of attention that couldn't be rushed. Jonathan, a boy then, hadn't understood the weight of those words. But now, standing here in the filtered morning light, he realized how they had shaped him. The orchard, in its own way, had been his teacher. Through seasons of abundance and seasons of want, It had shown him that not everything could be hurried, that some things required the slow work of years, and perhaps the lantern faithfully lit each night was a part of that same lesson, a symbol of care that persisted quietly without asking for notice. As the sun rose higher, the dampness began to lift from the grass, and the orchard took on a different warmth. He walked back toward the lantern, pausing once more beside it. He imagined what it might look like tonight, when the day's brightness had given way to shadow and the glow would return, steady and unassuming. He thought too about how someone, somewhere, maybe long gone now, had decided it should be lit, perhaps for safety, perhaps for welcome, perhaps for love. Jonathan didn't know all the answers, but he felt certain of this. He would keep the lantern burning as long as he could, not because it was expected and not because it was needed in any practical sense, but because some lights were worth tending, simply for the sake of what they represented. With that quiet conviction, he turned toward the house, the soft grass whispering beneath his steps. The orchard behind him swayed gently in the breeze, and though the lantern was dark now, he carried its presence with him, as if the glow had settled somewhere inside. Evening gathered the way a careful hand gathers a shawl, slowly, without tugging, drawing the day in close. Henry stepped onto the porch with the lantern held easy at his side. The air had that gentle, certain coolness it only takes on when summer finally bows and lets autumn stand in the doorway. A low wind drifted across the grass, carrying the mixed scent of dry leaves and the faint sweetness that still rose from the last apples on the trees. He paused at the top step and listened. The orchard breathed in that deep, steady way it had at this hour. The small hush of leaves meeting one another, the far-off stitch of crickets in the ditch, the light shift of a branch settling. Somewhere near the fence, a late bee worked a clover head as if it had forgotten the season. The creek beyond the back field kept a quiet conversation with its stones. Tonight would be different, but only in the gentlest way. Lucy had come earlier in the afternoon with a bundle of paper bags, a length of wire, and a tin of tea lights. Small things, but enough. She had stood at the kitchen table, folding and tucking, fashioning simple lanterns that would glow along the lane and around the orchard's edge. "It seemed right," she'd said, her voice low so as not to disturb the late sunlight. "A night to mark what has been tended." Henry had watched her hands moving with that familiar carefulness, steady, never hurried, then nodded and fetched the old tin snips and spool of wire from the shed. They had worked without ceremony, Lucy measuring and punching neat air holes along the paper's tops, Henry shaping wire handles that would sit safely in small hooks they set along the fence posts. As they finished, the kitchen smelled faintly of paper and tea and the apples Henry had warmed that morning. Neither mentioned the word celebration. Neither needed to. Some nights announced themselves without a name. Now, with the sun sliding down the far hill and the sky thinning toward blue-gray, Henry carried his own lantern to the bench beneath the old apple tree. He hung it on its hook and struck a match. The flame caught as it always did, briefly eager, then calm, drawing the surrounding leaves into a softer green. For a moment he stood close, his hand on the tree's coarse bark, feeling the faint warmth gather and hold. There had never been a reason large enough to justify this light to anyone who needed reasons, but it had never asked for one. He turned toward the lane and saw Lucy coming over the rise, her cardigan buttoned to the collar, a wicker basket looped over one arm. She lifted the basket when she reached the gate, Inside were the paper lanterns they had made, stacked like small sleeping houses. "Shall I start along the fence?" she asked. "If you'll take the lower posts," Henry said, smiling. "I'll follow you along the top." They moved in companionable silence, hooking lanterns where the wire glinted, setting tea lights inside their paper rooms, and waiting for the first small flames to find their shape. One by one, the little lights took, brightened, and steadied. From the lane, they would look like a necklace of dim stars fallen to earth. From here, they looked like what they were, the simplest kind of welcome. By the time they reached the last post, the sky had darkened to a gentle slate. Lucy tucked her hands into her sleeves and stepped back to admire the curve of light hugging the orchard's edge. "It's enough," she said, the words sounding like a verdict and a blessing at once. Henry felt it too, the way the lights, though small, made the night deeper around them, as if drawing a boundary where quiet and kindness were asked to stay. He thought of Claire then, not in the old aching way, but with the steady gratitude that comes when a remembered voice is no longer a wound. She would have liked the modesty of this. No speeches, no crowds pressing, just the lane, the fence, the orchard, and a thread of small fires to mark the way. The town began to arrive the way dusk arrives, slowly, then all at once, though without any hurry. First came Mr. and Mrs. Callahan, walking in steps that had learned consideration from years of walking together. Behind them, the postmaster with his daughter, the child's hand folded firmly into his. Neighbors drifted in ones and twos and small family knots, boots soft on the lane, whispers unspooling into the light. No one called out. Voices settled into the same volume as the evening itself. They paused where the lanterns ran along the fence, leaning elbows to rails, pointing with chins rather than fingers. A few nodded toward Henry and Lucy, not to intrude, but to include. The orchard held them all without strain, as if it had been built for such a night, as, in some human way, it had. Lucy slipped through the gate and moved among the first arrivals with an ease that surprised even her. She showed the children how to cup their hands if the breeze threatened a flame. She straightened a listing handle. She tied back a loose strand of hair and laughed quietly at something the postmaster's daughter said about stars hiding in paper. When she circled back to the bench beneath the old apple tree, Henry had brought 2 mugs of warm cider from the kitchen, steam lifting in soft ribbons. "Your grandmother used to stand about there," Henry said after they had taken a few slow sips, nodding toward a gap in the fence, just beyond the gate, where she could see both the lane and the far row. She liked to be where she could meet whoever came and also watch who needed a coat. Lucy's smile was small and true. She had a way of knowing the second thing first. She said, who needed the coat rather than who might arrive. They'd let the thought rest between them, warming its hands at their cups. As the evening deepened, the lanterns drew the town into a single gentle rhythm. No one hurried. A boy asked if he might carry a paper light a few steps down the lane and then carefully returned it to its post, looking back to make sure it had not minded the journey. Someone began, without planning to hum, a tune so simple it could have been a fragment of wind. Another voice found the note and held it a little longer. Soon the sound threaded between the lanterns, not a song exactly, but the memory of one. Henry left the bench and walked the inner row of trees, checking on the hooks and watching the way the lights made little windows on the leaves. In the second row, he found the place where the ground dipped toward the creek and stood a long minute to listen. When he returned, Lucy had set 2 small paper lanterns on the bench itself, one on either side of the old brass lamp, their milky sides glowing like moons beside a sun. "Do you ever think," Lucy asked when he had settled again, "about how the light knows where to stop? How it makes a room out of the night, but never tries to turn the night into day?" "I do," Henry said. "I think that's one of the reasons it feels like company instead of correction." They sat without talking for a while, and the town moved gently around them, small clusters breaking and reforming, greetings spoken with little more than a touch to a shoulder, a close lean toward an ear, a nod that meant lingering was welcome. Babies slept in arms. A teenager, shy in tallness, stood with hands in his pockets close to the fence and regarded the orchard with an expression that made Henry think of his younger self, unsure of the size of the world, but ready to practice belonging. From habit more than decision, Henry rose when the first thin chill found its way into the grass. He walked to the old tree and lifted the brass lantern from its hook. The flame did not falter. He carried it along the fence in a slow procession, pausing at each paper light as if to bless it. Neighbors stepped aside, making space without being asked. At the far post, the one that leaned slightly from years of frost and thaw, he turned, and the town turned with him, as if they, too, understood that some movements deserved a shared attention even when no one spoke their meaning. Henry held the lantern a little higher. The warm circle slipped over faces he had known for decades, over faces he had met only as nods across the market stalls, over children he could not yet name. It touched Lucy where she stood near the gate, the light nesting briefly in her eyes before moving on. Then he set the lantern back in its place beneath the old apple tree, where it had always wanted to be. The moment's quiet did not break. It opened. Someone near the lane cleared a throat softly, and the town breathed as one body, out, then in. A few people drifted homeward, the lanterns leading them only to the bend where a memory could take over. Others lingered, the way you linger in a doorway when there is nothing urgent calling you inside. Lucy edged closer to the bench and placed her hand flat on its weathered board. "I think," she said, not looking away from the glow, "that I could keep it if you ever needed me to. The lighting, the tending, the way it marks the evenings." Henry looked at her hand, how easily it rested on the bench's grain, how sure it seemed without making any claim, and then at the lantern's steady flame. He felt, not the suddenness of decision, but the calm recognition of something already true. "You've been keeping it," he said quietly, "for some time now." She did not answer, and none was needed. They stood together in the lantern's modest halo, and watched the last of the neighbors make their good nights with small waves and backward glances. When the lane finally emptied and the paper lights along the fence burned lower, Lucy began to gather them, cupping each with her palm, breathing lightly in the direction of the flame until it let go, then unhooking the wire and laying it gently in the basket. Henry moved along the opposite posts, doing the same. The orchard received the dark again, slowly, as if aware it was being returned something precious. Back at the bench, only the brass lantern remained. Henry lowered the wick a little, and the flame softened to the size of a watchful eye. The tree above them rustled, one leaf then another, like a grandmother's shawl being settled over a chair. "Good night," Lucy said, hands slipping into her cardigan pockets. "Walk easy," Henry replied. "I'll watch the light until you reach the bend." She smiled and went through the gate. He kept his gaze on the place where the lane curved out of sight, the lantern steady at his shoulder, its warmth touching the skin of his cheek. When Lucy's shape blended with the dark and the sound of her steps left the grass to the crickets, Henry drew one deeper breath and turned the wick lower still. The flame listened, then agreed, becoming a small, steady ember. He did not blow it out at once. He sat on the bench and let the orchard speak the last words of the day, the creek's soft grammar, the cattle shifting once in the distant pasture, the moth writing its pale signature against the glass and then letting it fade. When at last he rose, he touched the lantern's frame with the gratitude you give to an old friend, and pinched the flame close with two sure fingers. Dark fell into place, whole but not empty. The bench remembered the warmth of two people's weight. The path kept an imprint of careful steps. The fence held a memory of stars cupped in paper. Henry carried the lantern back toward the house, its glass still warm in his hand, its dark interior holding the ghost of the evening's light. On the porch, he paused, looking once more across the orchard's rows. Even in shadow, he could trace them, a pattern learned by heart. He turned the knob, stepped inside, and set the lantern on the kitchen table. The room, quiet and kind, received it, filled the kettle and waited while it found its voice. Beyond the window, the orchard rested. Within the house, a gentler resting gathered, the kind that closes the distance between breath and sleep. When the tea was poured and the cup warmed his palms, Henry stood for a moment without drinking, letting the steam rise and disappear. Then he set the cup down, turned off the last small light, and listened once more to the night. There was nothing left to keep. Everything that mattered was already kept. The path, the bench, the tree, the tending, the promise that a light would meet the evening and show anyone passing that they were seen. And so the house settled, and the orchard settled, and the man whose hands had hung the lantern for so many years allowed his shoulders to loosen and his eyes to close. Sleep came the way evening had come, the way neighbors had come, the way autumn had come, gently, kindly, and exactly on time. As the last flicker of lantern light fades into the gentle embrace of the night, I hope this story has wrapped around you like a warm blanket, steady, quiet, and kind. May the images linger softly in your mind, guiding you away from the weight of the day and into a place where only peace remains. Tonight, wherever you are, I wish you the deepest rest. May your dreams be gentle, your breathing unhurried, and your heart light enough to drift easily into sleep. You've done enough. You've been enough. Now, let the night take care of you. Good night. If this story brought you a moment of calm, I'd love to hear from you. Just a few words in the comments, and tell me, what story would you like me to tell you next?